it was one of the longest and most brutal sieges of the Second World War. The Siege of Sevastopol, a fortress city on the Black Sea, a place where concrete bunkers, underground tunnels and towering cliffs turned into a battleground of endurance, fire and destruction. Beginning in the autumn of 1941 and lasting until the summer of 1942, Sevastopol became a symbol of Soviet resistance and a target of German determination. The Germans saw it as the gateway to the Caucasus, a fortress that had to fall before they could advance further south. The Soviets saw it as a bastion that had to be defended at all costs, no matter the sacrifice. For 8 relentless months, the city endured bombardments from land, sea, and air. The largest guns ever built in human history were dragged across the continent to pound its defenses. The mighty Schwerer Gustav, firing shells the size of railway cars, was turned against the underground fortifications. Stokers screamed overhead, ships pounded the coastline, and artillery rained without pause. Yet within the bunkers and tunnels, Soviet defenders clung to every inch of ground. Civilians and soldiers alike lived side by side in conditions of horror and deprivation, turning streets into trenches and buildings into fortresses. The fighting was relentless. Every hill and every bunker became a battlefield. The cost in lives was immense. The destruction was total, and yet the defense of Sevastopol delayed the German advance for months, proving the resilience of the Soviet people and the strategic importance of the Black Sea. In this documentary, we will explore the entire history of the Siege of Sevastopol, from the first German assaults to the epic bombardments to the final collapse of the defenders in July 1942. We will uncover the weapons, the commanders, the strategies, and the human stories that turned this city into a fortress remembered forever. But before we begin this deep dive into one of the most punishing sieges of the war, I want to ask you, where are you tuning in from, and what time of day is it as you listen to this story of fire, steel, and human endurance in the Siege of Sevastopol? Sevastopol, perched on the rugged Crimean Peninsula, was more than just a city. It was the very beating heart of Soviet naval power in the south. Its deep natural harbor, carved by millennia of geological forces, offered shelter for fleets that could dominate the Black Sea. The city's coastline stretched in jagged inlets and fortified cliffs, a natural fortress strengthened by human ingenuity. Long before the Second World War, the Tsars and later the Soviets poured immense resources into its defenses, recognizing its unmatched strategic position. Naval yards clanged with steel and echoed with hammer blows as warships took shape under towering cranes. Soviet officers spoke of Sevastopol not as a mere base, but as a symbol of pride, a jewel of their military heritage. By 1941, its population of nearly 110,000 bustled with sailors, dock workers, engineers, and their families, each tied in some way to the fortress city. Great concrete batteries lined the headlands, their guns commanding the sea approaches with unyielding menace. Beneath the hills, a labyrinth of bunkers and tunnels formed an underground city, hidden from the prying eyes of the enemy. Sevastopol was not simply a point on the map, it was the anchor of Soviet dominance in the Black Sea. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet, headquartered in Sevastopol, was a formidable force by the eve of the German invasion. With battleships like the Paridskaya Kommuna, cruisers such as Krasny Krim and Chervona Ukraina, and swarms of destroyers and submarines, the fleet could project Soviet power across the entire sea. Its presence guaranteed supply lines to southern Ukraine and offered the promise of striking at Romania's vital oil fields. Soviet commanders believed that with Sevastopol secure, Axis ambitions in the south could be checked. The fleet sailors trained rigorously, conducting live-fire exercises that thundered across the bay and echoed into the city streets. In the minds of both civilians and officers, the city and the fleet were inseparable, each sustaining the other. Even the schools and cultural institutions of Sevastopol carried naval traditions, with children taught to swim, sail, and understand the sea from an early age. To the outside world, the Black Sea Fleet seemed an untouchable bulwark, ready to challenge any intruder. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, with aging vessels, shortages of modern equipment, and uneven training for the new conscripts. Still, the sheer aura of the fleet gave Sevastopol a confidence that few Soviet cities possessed in 1941. Sevastopol's geography gave it a defensive advantage that few fortresses in Europe could match. The city sprawled across a series of natural amphitheaters, each bay acting as a ready-made naval dock. To the north, the Inkerman Heights loomed like watchful sentinels, while to the south, Sapun Ridge formed a natural shield. The terrain allowed artillery emplacements to dominate approaches both by land and sea. Deep ravines cut into the landscape, forcing attackers into narrow corridors where defenders could concentrate fire. The harbour itself, protected by massive coastal batteries, was nearly impregnable to direct naval assault. Engineers had embedded armoured turrets into rock faces, some armed with naval-caliber guns capable of hurling shells far beyond the horizon. Fort Maxim Gorky, with its twin 305mm battleship guns, was the crown jewel of these defences. Underground, a network of magazines and barracks kept the gunners supplied and protected, ensuring that even the heaviest bombardments could not silence them easily. Every hill, every bay, and every bunker turned Sevastopol into a fortress that seemed to defy conquest. The city's role as a naval bastion shaped its daily life in profound ways. Streets rang with the footsteps of sailors on leave, their uniforms a familiar sight to civilians who viewed them as protectors. Shipyards provided thousands of jobs, from welders and machinists to women assembling torpedoes and shells in the factories. Markets bustled with fresh produce, wine from the Crimean vineyards, and fish hauled in from the Black Sea. Cultural life reflected the naval heritage. Theatres staged patriotic plays, and songs about the fleet echoed from radios in working-class homes. The city carried itself with a sense of pride, a belief that they stood on the front line of Soviet strength. Yet this pride was balanced by discipline, for the NKVD kept close watch on the population, ensuring loyalty in a region historically contested between empires. Even as the war loomed in the distance, Sevastopol's people believed their fortress would hold, their fleet would endure, and their sacrifices would matter. Children played in the courtyards near air raid shelters already prepared beneath apartment blocks. Daily life in Sevastopol in 1941 was a mixture of normalcy and readiness, of confidence and quiet apprehension. Every hammer strike in the shipyard and every drill on the parade ground reminded the citizens that they lived in a city of war. Strategically, Sevastopol was indispensable to Soviet command planning. From here, submarines could prowl the Axis shipping lanes to Romania, threatening the oil lifeline of Ploiești. Destroyers and cruisers could launch raids against the Bulgarian and Romanian coasts, keeping enemy garrisons off balance. The base also served as a staging ground for reinforcing southern Ukraine, with supply convoys threading through the Black Sea under the fleet's protection. For the Germans, this made Sevastopol an intolerable threat, a dagger pointed at the very heart of their southern strategy. The city's capture would not only neutralize the Black Sea Fleet, but also open the way to the Caucasus oil fields. For Hitler and the German High Command, Sevastopol became both a prize and an obstacle, something that had to be taken regardless of cost. Meanwhile, Soviet planners in Moscow clung to the belief that the fortress could withstand any assault, just as Port Arthur had once done in the Russo-Japanese War. Military theorists in both camps studied the city's defenses, weighing its potential to delay or destroy enemy plans. In the minds of generals and admirals alike, Sevastopol was a fortress that could determine the fate of entire campaigns. Behind the towering walls of fortifications were the men and women who would later endure the storm. Sailors of the fleet trained daily in gunnery, navigation, and amphibious tactics, while Red Army divisions rotated through the city to prepare for defense. Anti-aircraft crews practiced their drills with old but serviceable guns, their eyes scanning the skies for the bombers everyone knew would come. Naval infantry, the famed Black Death of the Soviet forces, stood ready to repel any assault with ruthless determination. Women were not absent from this preparation. Many trained as medics, signal operators, and even gunners on anti-aircraft positions. In the underground hospitals, doctors rehearsed mass casualty drills, knowing that one day they would be overwhelmed. Civil defense brigades dug trenches, stockpiled sandbags, and painted windows to reduce the glare of bombing raids. Every household kept emergency supplies of water and bread, for the spectre of blockade loomed large in collective memory. Sevastopol's people were not ignorant of the danger. They were bound to it by geography and history. In 1941, the fortress was alive with purpose, every citizen a cog in the great machine of defense. Yet beneath the surface of this fortress pride lay vulnerabilities that would soon be tested. Many of the fleet's warships were relics of an earlier era, their machinery worn and their armaments outdated. The Soviet naval air arm lagged behind its German counterpart, with fewer planes, less training, and limited fuel reserves. Communications equipment was unreliable, and coordination between the Army and Navy often broke down in practice. Ammunition stockpiles, while substantial, were scattered and not always well protected from aerial bombardment. Food supplies were sufficient in peacetime, but sustaining a long siege against a modern mechanized enemy would prove another matter entirely. The sprawling defensive network, though formidable, was incomplete in places, with trenches left unfinished and minefields poorly marked. Even the mighty coastal guns, for all their power, depended on limited ammunition reserves and vulnerable supply lines. These cracks, invisible to the proud citizens, would one day widen under the relentless pressure of siege. Still, in the summer of 1941, Sevastopol's defenders believed the city could endure anything. They would learn all too soon the terrible reality of modern siege warfare. As Operation Barbarossa erupted in June 1941, the shadow of war crept closer to Crimea's southern shores. Refugees from Ukraine began to arrive, telling of German tanks and Stuka dive bombers tearing through the steppe. Radio broadcasts carried both Soviet propaganda and whispered truths of catastrophic losses at the front. For the people of Sevastopol, the fortress walls felt solid, the fleet invincible, and the guns eternal, yet unease simmered in quiet conversations. Commanders in Moscow issued urgent orders to prepare for the possibility of attack, shifting fresh units into the peninsula. The fleet went on high alert, its ships patrolling the Black Sea with a newfound intensity. Factories accelerated production, and citizens lined up for ration cards, knowing shortages were inevitable. The airfields buzzed with activity as fighters and bombers dispersed to hardened shelters. Every day, the war edged closer, and with it came the certainty that Sevastopol's fate would soon be tested. The Black Sea stronghold stood ready, proud yet vulnerable, awaiting the storm that would define its place in history. On June 22, 1941, as dawn broke over Eastern Europe, the thunder of guns and the roar of engines shattered the fragile peace along a 2,000-mile front. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand gamble, had begun with 3 massive army groups driving deep into Soviet territory. To the north, Army Group North surged toward Leningrad, while Army Group Center lunged for Moscow with overwhelming force. In the south, Army Group South pressed toward Ukraine, tasked with securing the fertile breadbasket and the oil fields beyond. Within this southern thrust lay a jewel the Germans could not ignore: the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea jutted into the Black Sea like a dagger, commanding sea lanes and threatening the flank of any Axis advance toward the Caucasus. Sevastopol, its fortress capital, represented not only Soviet naval strength, but also the gateway to control of the Black Sea itself. For Hitler and his generals, Crimea was both a threat and an opportunity, a piece of territory that could not be left in Soviet hands. From the first day of Barbarossa, the question of Crimea's fate was already written into the German war plans. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, faced a daunting task of conquering Ukraine and stretching its reach toward the Caucasus. Rundstedt's forces included the 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist and the 11th Army under Erich von Manstein. While the panzers swept eastward across the vast steppes, Manstein's 11th Army bore the burden of advancing into Crimea. Crimea was not simply a regional prize, but a keystone of German strategic thinking, for it shielded the vital Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. If the Soviets retained Crimea, their bombers and submarines could strike the oil lifeline of the German war machine. Hitler, obsessed with securing resources, insisted that Crimea must be taken at all costs, declaring it a giant Soviet aircraft carrier threatening Germany's southern flank. For the 11th Army, this meant a campaign unlike the fast-moving panzer thrusts elsewhere, requiring siege warfare, amphibious operations, and coordination with the Luftwaffe. German planners understood that the terrain of Crimea, its narrow necks, mountains, and fortified ports, would test their endurance. Even before the first shots were fired in the peninsula, Sevastopol loomed large as the ultimate objective. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, also recognized Crimea's critical importance. To them, it was not only the bastion of the Black Sea Fleet, but also a shield for the southern approaches to the Soviet Union. From Crimea, Soviet submarines prowled against Axis shipping, and air bases launched raids that rattled Romanian oil production. Stalin himself placed great symbolic value on Sevastopol, comparing it to Port Arthur and other legendary fortresses of Russian military history. Defending the peninsula fell to the Soviet Coastal Army, reinforced by naval infantry and supported by the Black Sea Fleet. The Soviets had prepared for years, constructing concrete bunkers, laying minefields, and building underground tunnels carved into the rocky hills. Yet for all their preparations, they were caught off guard by the speed and violence of Barbarossa. German panzers cut deep into Ukraine, severing railways and threatening the land routes that connected Crimea to the rest of the Soviet Union. Almost overnight, the peninsula that had felt secure became a target, a place where the war would soon arrive with full fury. For the Germans, the advance toward Crimea was not only about strategy, but also about prestige. Hitler viewed the capture of Sevastopol as a political triumph, a symbol that German arms could humble even the strongest Soviet fortress. The Luftwaffe, commanded in the south by General Wolfram von Richthofen, prepared to unleash its Stuka dive bombers against Soviet positions. Richthofen believed that air power could crush the fortress by severing its supply lines and bombarding its defenses into submission. The 11th Army gathered siege artillery, including colossal mortars and railway guns that would later become infamous. Romanian divisions, fighting alongside the Germans, were tasked with providing manpower for assaults and holding long front lines. The Germans planned meticulously, but they also underestimated Soviet resilience and the logistical challenges of fighting in Crimea. The narrow Perekop Isthmus, the gateway to the peninsula, was heavily fortified and could funnel attackers into deadly kill zones. German generals debated how quickly Crimea could be taken, some imagining weeks, others warning of months. The reality would exceed even the darkest estimates. For the people of Crimea, the storm of Barbarossa arrived in waves of rumor, refugees, and finally, violence. Villages on the steppe trembled as retreating Soviet columns clattered past, their faces grim and uniforms torn. Civilians whispered of German tanks, black crosses painted on their armor, sweeping through the countryside with terrifying speed. Farmers abandoned fields of ripening grain, fleeing southward toward the perceived safety of Sevastopol. In the ports, workers labored night and day to strengthen fortifications, while ships of the Black Sea Fleet slipped out to sea on urgent patrols. Soviet propaganda reassured the people that the fortress was impregnable, that the enemy would be repelled as in past wars. Yet the older generation remembered the Crimean War of the 1850s, when Sevastopol had endured a long and bloody siege against foreign invaders. That memory now resurfaced, a ghost of endurance and suffering hanging over the city. Soldiers arriving to defend the peninsula were greeted with cheers, yet also with quiet fear. Crimea was becoming the next great battlefield of Hitler's war of annihilation. As German columns pressed deeper into Ukraine, the Axis command grew increasingly aware of the challenges ahead. Supply lines stretched thin across vast distances, horses struggled in the dust and heat, and fuel shortages slowed the mechanized spearheads. Manstein, newly promoted to lead the 11th Army, assessed his forces with a cold, calculating eye. His divisions were well trained but lacked the armored punch of other German formations, relying instead on infantry, artillery, and the support of their Romanian allies. For an assault on Crimea, Manstein would need to combine patient siege tactics with the ruthless application of modern firepower. He began planning for the use of colossal artillery pieces, weapons designed not merely to break walls, but to pulverize entire fortifications. These plans would take months to unfold, yet already the vision of Sevastopol's falls occupied the German mind. In the meantime, Soviet resistance on the approaches to Crimea proved far more determined than many in Berlin had anticipated. The stage was set for a brutal contest of endurance, with both sides convinced of the peninsula's decisive importance. Inside Sevastopol itself, the atmosphere shifted from prideful confidence to urgent preparation. The city mobilized every resource at its disposal, with civilians drafted into labor battalions to build defenses. Women hauled stones for barricades, children collected scrap metal, and elderly men dug trenches on the outskirts of the city. The naval yards worked without pause, repairing ships damaged in early air raids and producing weapons for the army. Military hospitals expanded into basements and tunnels, anticipating waves of casualties. Commanders coordinated with the Black Sea Fleet to establish evacuation routes and emergency supply convoys. Even as German forces closed in, ships continued to bring reinforcements and ammunition from other ports. The mood was tense but unbroken as Sevastopol's people steeled themselves for the trial to come. The fortress had not yet been attacked directly, but its defenders knew the storm was approaching. In their minds, the shadow of Barbarossa stretched longer each day, darkening the horizon over the Black Sea. By the end of summer 1941, the outlines of the coming struggle were unmistakable. German forces had swept through much of Ukraine, capturing cities and cutting supply lines, leaving Crimea increasingly isolated. The Luftwaffe intensified its raids on Black Sea ports, testing the defenses of Sevastopol and sinking ships in harbors. Soviet commanders rushed reinforcements into the peninsula, but each arrival seemed only to delay the inevitable. For the Germans, Crimea had become a fixed objective, a campaign that could not be postponed or ignored. For the Soviets, it was a bastion to be held at any cost, a fortress that embodied both strategic necessity and national pride. As autumn approached, both sides prepared for a clash unlike any other, one that would pit modern firepower against ancient fortifications. The soldiers on either side, many barely out of youth, sensed they were about to enter a crucible of unimaginable violence. Every trench dug, every gun emplaced, every order issued carried the weight of history. The shadow of Barbarossa had fallen fully upon Crimea, and with it came the certainty of a siege that would define the fate of Sevastopol. By late summer 1941, the Axis juggernaut was rolling relentlessly across the southern steppes, and the road to Crimea finally opened before them. Army Group South had carved through Soviet defenses, capturing vast stretches of Ukraine with terrifying speed and precision. For the 11th Army under Erich von Manstein, the next objective was clear: breach the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow land bridge that guarded the entrance to Crimea. This strip of land, barely 5 miles wide, had been fortified for centuries, first by Crimean Tatars, later by Tsarist armies, and most recently by Soviet engineers. The Soviets had transformed Perekop into a killing ground, with trenches, barbed wire, minefields, and concrete bunkers designed to bleed any attacker white. Beyond Perekop lay the Crimean steppe, a vast open landscape that stretched toward the fortress city of Sevastopol. To break through here was to open the gate to the peninsula, but it would not come easily. Manstein knew that speed and coordination would be his greatest weapons, but he also understood the price would be paid in blood. The first drive into Crimea was about to begin, and with it one of the fiercest contests of the southern campaign. Erich von Manstein, tall, composed, and ruthlessly intelligent, approached the task with his usual meticulousness. Unlike the flamboyant panzer leaders of the German army, Manstein was methodical, a strategist who weighed every detail before committing his forces. He understood the value of deception, of maneuver, and of applying force at the precise point of weakness. The 11th Army under his command numbered around 200,000 men, including German divisions and allied Romanian units. The Romanians, led by General Petre Dumitrescu, would play a crucial role in supporting German advances, though often with less equipment and training. The army carried with it the full weight of German firepower, artillery regiments, assault guns, and the dreaded Stuka dive bombers circling overhead. Manstein's challenge was to orchestrate this vast orchestra of war against a fortress defense that the Soviets had prepared with grim determination. The Germans had learned from early clashes in Ukraine that Soviet troops, once derided as poorly led and weak, could fight with unexpected ferocity when defending key terrain. The coming battle at Perekop would test not only Manstein's generalship, but also the fighting spirit of his army and its allies. The Soviet defenders of the Perekop Isthmus belonged primarily to the 51st Army, commanded by General Fyodor Kuznetsov. They were a mix of regular Red Army divisions, hastily mobilized militia, and naval infantry dispatched from Sevastopol. Their orders were simple yet absolute: hold the line at all costs, prevent the Germans from entering Crimea. The Perekop defenses consisted of multiple trench lines, barbed wire belts, and the historic Tatar Ditch, a massive earthwork dating back centuries, now reinforced with bunkers and artillery. Soviet engineers had dug anti-tank ditches, planted minefields, and constructed fortified machine gun nests along every approach. Behind these defences, artillery batteries concealed in camouflaged positions waited to unleash hell on any German advance. Supplies and reinforcements streamed in from Sevastopol, carried by rail across the peninsula and escorted by elements of the Black Sea Fleet. For the soldiers in the trenches, conditions were brutal. Heat baked the steppe by day, while nights brought chilling winds and constant fear of bombardment. Yet morale held firm, for they knew that behind them lay Crimea itself, and beyond it the fortress city that Stalin demanded be held. In their eyes, they were the shield of the Black Sea. The German assault began with the methodical precision for which the Wehrmacht was feared. Artillery batteries opened fire in rolling barrages, their shells exploding across Soviet trench lines in deafening waves. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their sirens wailing as bombs blasted apart bunkers and sent soil and bodies flying. German infantry advanced behind this wall of fire, crawling through barbed wire and charging across open ground under withering Soviet fire. The Soviets responded with desperate ferocity, machine guns rattling from concealed nests, mortars raining shells, and snipers picking off advancing officers. The Tatar Ditch, a centuries-old scar across the land, became a cauldron of death as both sides poured men into its defences. German combat engineers, carrying explosives and flamethrowers, crawled forward to blast open passages through minefields and obstacles. The Romanians, less well-equipped but no less determined, pressed their attacks alongside the Germans, suffering grievous losses. By nightfall, the battlefield was a shattered landscape of smoking craters, broken wire, and fallen men. Yet despite the fury of the German onslaught, the Soviet lines at Perekop still held. The drive into Crimea was proving far bloodier than Manstein had anticipated. For 3 days, the battle raged with unrelenting violence, each assault met by stubborn Soviet resistance. German infantry regiments hurled themselves against the trenches, only to be repelled time and again by withering fire. Casualties mounted as platoons were cut to pieces, crossing exposed ground under artillery and machine gun bursts. Manstein, observing the battle from his forward headquarters, adjusted his tactics, ordering concentrated artillery fire on key strongpoints. The Luftwaffe intensified its raids, Stukas hammering Soviet command posts and supply dumps with terrifying accuracy. Slowly, cracks began to appear in the Soviet defenses, as ammunition dwindled and communication lines broke down. Soviet soldiers fought with bayonets and grenades when their rifles ran dry, refusing to yield even in the face of overwhelming firepower. Naval infantry counterattacked at night, slipping through the darkness to strike at German positions with knives and submachine guns. Each clash was brutal, fought at close quarters in trenches choked with smoke, blood, and shattered earth. By the 4th day, the German advance had carved a shallow foothold, but at terrible cost. The Perekop Isthmus was becoming a graveyard for both armies. Despite the carnage, the Germans pressed relentlessly forward, drawing on their superiority in coordination and logistics. Fresh artillery batteries were brought up, firing ceaselessly day and night to wear down Soviet defenders. German engineers bridged anti-tank ditches under heavy fire, constructing passageways for assault guns and light tanks. The Romanians, enduring heavy casualties, managed to seize secondary trench lines, proving their resilience despite inferior equipment. Soviet defenders, exhausted and running low on supplies, held with grim determination, their officers urging them on, with promises of reinforcements from Sevastopol. Yet the reality was grim. Reinforcements arrived in dribbles, often caught by German bombers before reaching the front. The battlefield became a landscape of horror, where bodies lay unburied and the air stank of cordite and death. Still, neither side gave quarter, for both understood that the fate of Crimea hung in the balance. For the Germans, victory meant access to the peninsula and the beginning of their march to Sevastopol. For the Soviets, defeat meant opening the gates to the fortress they had sworn to protect. The struggle at Perekop was nothing less than a battle for the soul of Crimea. At last, after days of savage combat, the German 11th Army succeeded in breaking through the Soviet defenses. Assault groups stormed across the breached trenches, overrunning bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. The Tatar ditch, once an insurmountable barrier, was crossed under a storm of fire, its defenders killed or forced to retreat. Soviet forces fell back in disorder, some fighting to the last bullet, others captured in the chaos. German soldiers, bloodied and exhausted, planted their standards on captured strongpoints as proof of their victory. Manstein, calm and collected, noted the success, but also the enormous cost in men and material. The Soviets, though defeated at Perekop, had bought precious time, delaying the German advance and inflicting casualties that could not easily be replaced. The 11th Army pressed southward, entering the wide steppes of Crimea, its eyes fixed on Sevastopol in the distance. Yet the defenders had not been broken. They regrouped on new defensive lines, ready to resist again. The first drive into Crimea had opened the door, but the struggle for the peninsula had only just begun. For the men who fought at Perekop, the battle left scars that would never fade. German infantry recalled the choking dust, the searing heat, and the unrelenting fire that seemed to come from every direction. Romanian soldiers spoke of comrades cut down beside them, their courage tested in ways they had never imagined. Soviet veterans remembered the desperate hand-to-hand struggles in trenches filled with blood and mud, fighting with bayonets when ammunition was gone. Civilians in nearby villages recounted the thunder of artillery that shook their homes and the streams of wounded carried back from the front. Survivors on both sides would later describe Perekop as a place where death seemed constant and survival a matter of chance. Yet in the aftermath, the significance was undeniable. The gate to Crimea had been forced open. The 11th Army now stood poised to march deeper into the peninsula, toward the fortress city of Sevastopol. For the Soviets, the loss of Perekop was bitter, but it did not break their will to fight. The stage was set for the next chapter of the campaign, a brutal contest that would soon engulf all of Crimea. With the Perekop line breached and German forces advancing deeper into Crimea, all eyes turned toward Sevastopol, the fortress city on the Black Sea. Soviet commanders knew that if the enemy reached its gates, only the strongest defenses could prevent disaster. Plans that had been drawn up years earlier now took on desperate urgency as engineers, soldiers, and civilians worked day and night to turn the city into an impregnable bastion. Sevastopol's rocky hills and deep ravines lent themselves naturally to fortification, but it was human effort that transformed them into a true stronghold. Concrete bunkers sprouted across the ridgelines, their steel embrasures bristling with machine guns and artillery. Underground tunnels wound beneath the city like arteries, connecting command posts, ammunition stores, and medical stations. Naval engineers reinforced coastal batteries with additional armor, embedding them directly into the cliffs above the harbor. Every available stretch of terrain was surveyed, mapped, and transformed into killing zones, where attackers would be caught in overlapping fields of fire. For the Soviets, Sevastopol was no longer just a naval base. It was to be a fortress capable of withstanding the full might of the German war machine. The Black Sea Fleet played a central role in this defensive effort, its warships becoming floating fortresses in their own right. Battleships like Peredskaya Komuna anchored in the harbour, their massive 305mm guns capable of lobbing shells far inland. Cruisers such as Krasny Krim and destroyer squadrons stood ready to provide fire support against any landward assault. Submarines prowled the sea lanes, their presence ensuring that German and Romanian supply convoys could never move unchallenged. Fleet engineers stripped older ships of their heavy guns, installing them in shore batteries that dotted the approaches to the city. Some were placed on armoured turrets embedded in concrete, turning naval firepower into immovable land defences. The fleet also provided manpower, with naval infantry regiments, black-uniformed marines, renowned for their toughness and discipline. These sea soldiers would form a vital backbone of Sevastopol's defences, fighting with the same ferocity on land as they did aboard their ships. To the people of Sevastopol, the sight of naval guns thunderously firing inland was a reassurance that their city remained under the fleet's protection. The fortress and the fleet were one, inseparable in purpose and destiny. At the heart of Sevastopol's defences stood its great fortresses, constructed over decades but continually upgraded for modern war. Fort Stalin, Fort Lenin, and the formidable Fort Maxim Gorky dominated the approaches, their names echoing the Soviet state's unyielding resolve. Fort Maxim Gorky, carved into solid rock, boasted twin 305mm naval guns mounted in armoured turrets, each capable of devastating long-range fire. These guns, originally designed for battleships, were now tasked with smashing tank columns and German artillery positions. Beneath the surface, miles of tunnels connected ammunition magazines, barracks and command centres, ensuring defenders could move unseen and protected. Ventilation shafts disguised as wells or chimneys provided air, while electrical systems kept the underground world alive. Smaller forts dotted the ridges and ravines, creating a defensive web where no single breakthrough could collapse the entire line. Machine gun nests were camouflaged beneath brush, anti-tank ditches were carved across open approaches, and minefields littered the landscape. Together, these fortifications gave Sevastopol the appearance of a fortress city, both above and below ground. To the Soviets, it was a shield forged from steel, stone, and sacrifice. The task of organizing this massive defense fell to Vice Admiral Philip Oktyabrski, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, and General Ivan Petrov, leader of the separate coastal army. Oktyabrski, a career naval officer, coordinated fleet operations, ensuring supplies and reinforcements continued to flow by sea. Petrov, hardened and pragmatic, commanded the army units manning the fortifications, shaping them into a cohesive defensive force. Their cooperation, though sometimes strained by differences in service traditions, was essential to the city's survival. Soviet command understood that Sevastopol could not be defended by the army or navy alone. It required the combined strength of both. Petrov's divisions, numbering tens of thousands, were reinforced by naval infantry, anti-aircraft regiments, and workers' battalions formed from civilians. Each commander worked to instill discipline and morale, knowing the siege ahead would demand superhuman endurance. Oktyabrski oversaw naval convoys that brought not only ammunition and fuel, but also entire units ferried in under constant threat from the Luftwaffe. Together they forged a defensive alliance that was both practical and symbolic, uniting land and sea in common cause. Their leadership gave the fortress its backbone, turning preparation into determined readiness. The human element of Sevastopol's defences was as vital as the steel and concrete. Civilians, far from passive observers, became active participants in the city's fortification. Women mixed cement, hauled stone, and dug trenches alongside soldiers and sailors. Children scurried through rubble collecting scrap metal, and carrying water to construction crews. Teachers and doctors volunteered for civil defense units, preparing shelters and emergency hospitals. Old men, many veterans of the Russian Civil War, took up rifles once again to stand guard over their neighborhoods. Factories within the city converted to wartime production, churning out ammunition, mortars, and spare parts for ships and guns. Propaganda posters urged every citizen to contribute, declaring Sevastopol a city of heroes. The NKVD maintained vigilance, rooting out defeatism and ensuring loyalty, though often at the cost of fear and suspicion. Despite shortages and hardships, the people embraced their role as defenders, bound by pride in their fortress and their fleet. In this atmosphere, every civilian became part of the garrison, their lives woven into the fabric of the city's defense. The defenses extended beyond static fortifications, with mobile units prepared to counter German breakthroughs. Armored brigades, though small in number, positioned themselves behind ridge lines, ready to strike at exposed infantry. Artillery regiments carefully concealed their guns, waiting to unleash devastating barrages when attackers funneled into ravines or open plains. Anti-aircraft units ringed the harbor, their weapons pointed skyward to ward off the inevitable Luftwaffe assault. Naval infantry were trained to deploy rapidly to threatened sectors, moving through tunnels and camouflaged routes to appear unexpectedly in battle. Engineers laid mines in fields and rigged bridges with explosives, ensuring every road could become a trap. Cavalry patrols scouted the hinterlands, providing early warning of German approaches through the Crimean steppe. Communication lines were laid deep underground, protected against bombardment, allowing commanders to coordinate defense even in chaos. Each unit, no matter how small, was assigned a role within the broader defensive plan. This layered strategy aimed to slow, exhaust, and bleed the Germans at every step. For the Soviets, every moment gained was another chance to strengthen the fortress and prepare for the storm. Conditions for the defenders were harsh, even before the siege began. Supplies strained under the constant demand of fortification work and the influx of soldiers. Rations were tightened, with bread and potatoes becoming staples, while luxuries vanished from markets. Water was stockpiled in underground reservoirs, for everyone knew that bombardment could sever pipelines at any moment. Tunnels, though protective, were stifling and damp, lit by flickering lamps that cast long shadows on weary faces. Sleep came in snatches, broken by the echo of drills, the crash of construction, and the distant rumble of approaching war. Medical staff treated injuries from labor accidents and air raid victims even before battle truly began. Yet morale, fueled by patriotism and the city's symbolic importance, remained remarkably resilient. Songs were sung in the evenings, soldiers wrote letters to families they might never see again, and newspapers trumpeted the fortress as unconquerable. The contrast between hardship and defiance defined daily life in Sevastopol. The defenders were already living in the rhythm of siege, long before the first shells fell. By autumn 1941, Sevastopol had transformed into a fortress city without equal in the Soviet Union. Its harbor bristled with warships, its hills crowned with forts, and its tunnels alive with men and supplies. Every road and ravine leading toward the city was marked for death, every approach covered by overlapping fields of fire. The Black Sea Fleet stood as a shield offshore, its guns ready to rain destruction on any German assault. Behind the lines, the people of Sevastopol had become soldiers in all but name, their labor embedded in every stone and bunker. Generals and admirals watched the horizon, knowing that sooner or later Manstein's 11th Army would appear. They also knew that when it did, the battle would not be measured in days but in months of unrelenting struggle. Sevastopol's defenders were prepared for a siege of unimaginable intensity, one that would test not only weapons but the very endurance of human spirit. The city waited in silence, its guns loaded, its tunnels manned, and its people resolved. The fortress had been forged, and the defenders were ready to face the firestorm that history was about to unleash. As autumn bled into winter, the German 11th Army under Erich von Manstein finally stood at the gates of Sevastopol. Weeks of fighting across the Crimean steppe had brought them to the fortress's outer lines, but the price had been steep in men and material. By November 1941, the German advance slowed not by lack of will, but by the sheer scale of Soviet resistance and the onset of brutal weather. Rain turned roads into quagmires, bogging down supply convoys, and forcing troops to wade knee-deep in freezing mud. The winds from the Black Sea cut like knives through wool uniforms, chilling soldiers to the bone. Yet Manstein, ever the strategist, believed a swift assault could bring Sevastopol to its knees before winter fully closed in. His staff drew up plans for a concentrated strike on the northern and eastern approaches, hoping to overwhelm Soviet defenses before they could fully consolidate. For the Germans, speed meant survival. Delay meant a drawn-out siege with dwindling resources. In the waning days of November, the order was given. The first great assault on Sevastopol was about to begin. Manstein's plan relied on coordination between artillery, infantry, and the ever-present Luftwaffe. German artillery regiments, including heavy 210mm howitzers and long-range 150mm guns, were hauled into position on ridges overlooking Soviet lines. For days before the assault, these guns roared ceaselessly, pounding trenches, bunkers, and suspected command posts. The Luftwaffe, led by Wolfram von Richthofen's 8th Air Corps, joined the bombardment, with Stuka dive bombers screaming down upon coastal batteries and supply depots. German infantry divisions, hardened by months of campaigning, prepared to storm fortified hills and ravines under this rolling wall of fire. Romanian units were assigned to secondary sectors, tasked with supporting attacks and guarding flanks. Engineers stockpiled explosives and flamethrowers, ready to blast open Soviet strongpoints. Manstein himself watched the preparations with cold confidence, convinced that no fortress could withstand such concentrated firepower. Yet beneath the smoke and thunder, Soviet defenders clung to their positions with a grim determination that artillery alone could not break. The stage was set for a brutal collision, where fortifications and human endurance would decide the outcome. The Soviets, under General Ivan Petrov and Admiral Philip Oktyabrski, had anticipated such an attack and prepared accordingly. Coastal batteries remained silent through much of the bombardment, conserving ammunition and waiting for targets they could see. Underground command posts coordinated defenses, even as shells shook the earth, their telephones buzzing with urgent reports from the front. Soviet infantry huddled in bunkers, enduring the storm with clenched jaws and the knowledge that the real fight would come after the barrage lifted. Naval infantry, dressed in their black uniforms, manned forward trenches, their submachine guns at the ready. Anti-aircraft batteries fired defiantly into the sky, bringing down German bombers that dared to fly too low. Supply convoys crept into the city by night, their headlights blacked out, unloading crates of ammunition that disappeared into the tunnels. Even civilians joined the effort, carrying water to soldiers, tending to the wounded, and digging new earthworks under fire. The Soviet command understood that this was not merely another battle, it was the opening of a siege that might last months. In every order, every action, and every sacrifice, the defenders braced themselves for the coming storm. On November 30th, the German infantry advanced behind the last waves of artillery fire, pouring into the northern approaches of Sevastopol. Columns of troops surged forward, their helmets glinting in the weak winter sun, their rifles fixed with bayonets. Engineers cut paths through minefields under fire, their progress marked by explosions and bodies flung into the air. The Soviets unleashed a storm of machine gun fire, cutting down attackers in swathes as they scrambled across open ground. Mortar shells rained down on advancing platoons, shattering formations and leaving the survivors to claw through smoke and mud. Stukas screamed overhead, striking Soviet strongpoints, only for defenders to re-emerge from the rubble moments later. Naval guns from Sevastopol's harbour thundered inland, their massive shells ploughing into German concentrations with devastating effect. German officers shouted their men forward, urging them across trenches and into close-quarters combat. The battlefield descended into chaos, a swirl of smoke, blood and steel, as both sides grappled for control. The first assault had begun, and it was every bit as savage as both sides had feared. One of the fiercest clashes unfolded around the northern fortifications near the Belbek Valley. Here Soviet gunners of Fort Stalin and Fort Lenin unleashed concentrated barrages on advancing German regiments. The German 132nd Infantry Division, advancing through ravines, found itself trapped in overlapping arcs of fire, suffering crippling losses. Flamethrower teams attempted to clear bunkers, but defenders counterattacked with grenades and submachine guns at close range. The Soviets fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their resistance transforming every hill and trench into a fortress of its own. German units adapted quickly, calling down artillery on strongpoints and sending pioneers forward with explosives to collapse bunkers. Casualties mounted on both sides, with stretcher-bearers dragging the wounded through mud thickened by blood and rain. Romanian troops supporting the flanks faced their own ordeal, struggling to hold ground against Soviet counterattacks. For hours the battle raged in this valley, a maelstrom of fire where no side could claim clear advantage. By nightfall the Germans had seized footholds, but the Soviets still held their main defensive lines. The Belbek Valley had become a place of agony, a testament to the tenacity of Sevastopol's defenders. Elsewhere, the Germans concentrated on Sapun Ridge, a dominating height that overlooked approaches to the city. Soviet engineers had turned the ridge into a fortress, with trenches, dugouts, and interlocking machine gun positions. German battalions stormed the slopes, only to be met with withering fire that cut them down in rows. Stuka bombardments cratered the ridgeline, but each time the smoke cleared, Soviet machine guns rattled anew. German artillery pounded the heights for hours, shaking the very ground, yet the defenders refused to yield. Fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, in trenches where bayonets and shovels became weapons of survival. The slopes of Sapun Ridge ran red as attackers and defenders grappled in the mud, neither side willing to break. German officers radioed back for reinforcements, convinced that the ridge could not be taken without staggering losses. The Soviets, emboldened by their success, launched counterattacks that forced the Germans to retreat to their starting lines. The ridge stood firm, a living wall between Manstein's army and Sevastopol. As the first assault dragged on, the toll on both armies grew catastrophic. German divisions reported companies reduced to half strength, their advance slowed to a crawl by stubborn resistance. Soviet defenders, though battered and exhausted, maintained cohesion through iron discipline and the constant reinforcement of naval infantry. Ammunition shortages plagued both sides, with soldiers scavenging from the fallen to keep fighting. The cold worsened, with sleet and freezing winds sapping morale and making every movement an ordeal. Medical stations overflowed, doctors amputating limbs by lantern light as the wounded cried out in agony. Supplies of food and fuel dwindled, forcing soldiers to fight hungry, shivering, and sleep-deprived. Yet neither side relented, for both understood the stakes. Sevastopol was not merely a city, but a symbol of endurance and conquest. German propaganda promised swift victory, while Soviet broadcasts vowed that the fortress would never fall. On the battlefield, these promises were paid for in blood, one trench and one hill at a time. By early December, it was clear that Manstein's first assault had failed to achieve its ultimate goal. Though the Germans had seized outer positions and inflicted terrible losses, Sevastopol's defences remained unbroken. The Soviets had absorbed the storm, bent but not shattered, their fortress still bristling with guns and unyielding defenders. Manstein, frustrated but calculating, recognized that the city would not fall to a quick strike. A prolonged siege was inevitable, one that would demand heavier artillery, more troops, and the relentless hammering of the Luftwaffe. For the defenders, the survival of this first assault became a symbol of their resilience, proof that Sevastopol could withstand the might of the German army. Civilians and soldiers alike drew pride from their defiance, even as they prepared for the hardships still to come. The battlefield around the city was littered with bodies, wrecked guns, and shattered earth, silent testimony to the ferocity of the clash. Both sides withdrew to regroup, knowing the struggle had only just begun. The first assault had ended, but the siege of Sevastopol was far from over. It had only entered its darkest phase. As December 1941 gave way to January, the siege of Sevastopol settled into a grinding war of endurance. The German 11th Army, bloodied from its failed assault, dug into the mud and frost around the city, their trenches stretching in ragged arcs across the frozen landscape. Soviet defenders, battered but unbroken, remained behind their concrete walls and underground bunkers, refusing to yield an inch of ground. The war of rapid movement that had defined the summer had now transformed into a static struggle, where each shell, each ration, and each degree of warmth mattered. The Black Sea wind swept across the battlefield with merciless ferocity, chilling soldiers who lacked proper winter clothing. German units, supplied by overstretched convoys across Ukraine, found themselves desperately short of fuel and food. Soviet garrisons inside Sevastopol fared little better, their rations cut to meager portions of bread, soup, and salted fish. Frostbite became as common an enemy as bullets, claiming fingers, toes, and sometimes lives. Both armies realized that winter had become a third combatant in the siege, as deadly and unrelenting as any opponent. The attrition of Sevastopol was not only a contest of arms but of survival itself. Manstein recognized that his army could not storm Sevastopol again without massive reinforcements and heavier weapons. Until those arrived, his forces were condemned to hold the siege lines and bleed the Soviets slowly. German artillery continued to shell the fortress daily, but ammunition was limited and had to be rationed carefully. The Luftwaffe flew fewer missions as weather-grounded aircraft, and fuel shortages limited their effectiveness. Infantry patrols crept forward at night to probe Soviet defenses, often returning with prisoners but also with heavy losses. Romanian divisions positioned on exposed flanks bore the brunt of Soviet counterattacks, suffering greatly in the frozen mud. Soldiers huddled in crude dugouts, burning whatever wood they could scavenge to keep from freezing. Supply convoys struggled to reach the front, their trucks stuck in snowdrifts or destroyed by Soviet air raids and partisans. Despite their discipline, German soldiers began to feel the strain of a campaign that offered little glory and no quick victory. Manstein's confidence remained unshaken in public, but privately he acknowledged the siege would become a drawn-out ordeal. The winter had given Sevastopol a temporary reprieve, but it also promised misery for both armies. Inside Sevastopol, the situation was equally grim, though morale remained defiantly high. Civilians crowded into underground shelters, their lives reduced to darkness, cold, and the constant echo of distant gunfire. Food became scarce, with bread rations cut to mere ounces per day, and fresh produce all but vanished. The Black Sea Fleet continued to bring supplies by sea, but convoys ran a gauntlet of Luftwaffe bombers and U-boats. Soviet commanders rationed ammunition carefully, ensuring that every bullet and shell was used to maximum effect. Medical supplies dwindled, forcing doctors to improvise with crude tools and limited anesthetics. Underground hospitals overflowed with the wounded, lit by dim lamps, and echoing with the groans of men who had lost limbs to both shells and frostbite. Civilians took on military tasks, manning observation posts, carrying water, and digging new trenches under fire. Despite the suffering, Soviet propaganda declared Sevastopol invincible, comparing it to heroic sieges of Russian history. Songs were sung in the bunkers, poems recited in whispers, and a spirit of defiance burned through the freezing darkness. For the people of Sevastopol, survival itself had become an act of resistance. The Soviet command inside the fortress balanced desperation with ingenuity. General Petrov rotated his troops through frontline positions, ensuring no unit was left exposed to the elements for too long. Admiral Oktyabrski coordinated supply runs across the Black Sea, with warships escorting transports carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Soviet gunners learned to conserve ammunition by firing only at carefully chosen targets, making each shell count. Engineers expanded underground storage depots, protecting supplies from German bombardments that cratered the surface above. Mines and barbed wire were constantly renewed, despite shortages of materials, by stripping metal from damaged ships and destroyed buildings. Anti-aircraft crews sharpened their aim with limited shells, determined to protect the convoys that kept the city alive. Soviet radio operators intercepted German communications, providing intelligence that helped predict enemy artillery barrages and troop movements. Discipline remained harsh, with the NKVD enforcing loyalty through both surveillance and punishment. Yet for all the hardship, cohesion held firm, the city united under the belief that Sevastopol could not be allowed to fall. In those frozen months, defiance became as important as firepower. For ordinary soldiers, winter meant a daily battle against hunger, cold, and exhaustion. German infantry crouched in muddy foxholes, their breath freezing in the air as they clutched rifles too cold to hold bare-handed. Soviet sentries patrolled the lines wrapped in blankets and scraps of fur, their eyes red from smoke and sleepless nights. Both sides scavenged what they could, slaughtering horses for food and burning wreckage to stay warm. Rations were meager, often nothing more than thin soup, a crust of bread or a handful of dried fish. Frostbite claimed entire companies, reducing combat strength before a shot was even fired. Letters from home rarely arrived, cut off by the chaos of war, leaving men isolated in silence. Disease spread quickly, with lice infestations and dysentery weakening already malnourished troops. Morale wavered, not because of cowardice, but because survival itself seemed uncertain with each passing day. Soldiers learned to measure time not in victories or defeats, but in the endurance of yet another freezing night. In the trenches and bunkers around Sevastopol, winter was the true enemy. The attritional struggle did not halt combat but reshaped it into a series of small, savage engagements. Night raids became common, with German patrols slipping towards Soviet wire and Soviet commandos striking deep into Axis positions. These raids were fought in silence, with knives, grenades, and submachine guns, leaving behind shattered dugouts and blood-soaked snow. Snipers on both sides haunted the no-man's land, their rifles cracking in the still air, turning any careless movement into sudden death. Artillery duels punctuated the monotony, sudden storms of fire that lasted minutes, but left the ground trembling. Each clash brought losses that neither side could easily replace, grinding down strength, little by little. Civilians in Sevastopol heard the echoes of these battles, knowing their fate hung on the courage of soldiers who never ceased fighting. Both armies adapted to the frozen stalemate, their commanders seeking ways to maintain pressure without exhausting their forces. For the Germans, attrition was a means to wear down Soviet willpower. For the Soviets, it was a test of endurance until reinforcements could arrive. The winter front became a battlefield of shadows, whispers, and sudden violence. Far beyond the peninsula, events on the wider Eastern Front influenced the siege in profound ways. The German drive toward Moscow faltered in the snow, forcing Hitler to reconsider his southern strategy. Resources that might have strengthened Manstein's 11th Army were diverted north, leaving him to hold the lines with what he had. For the Soviets, victories outside Moscow boosted morale, proving that the Germans were not invincible. Reinforcements, though scarce, trickled into Crimea by sea, bringing fresh faces to tired units. Stalin demanded that Sevastopol be held at all costs, declaring the fortress a symbol of Soviet endurance. This political weight elevated the siege beyond local importance, making it a test of will between two nations. German propaganda painted the fortress as doomed, while Soviet broadcasts proclaimed it eternal, unbreakable, and sacred. The truth was harsher, for both armies bled silently in the snow, while their leaders issued proclamations far from the front. The Siege of Sevastopol was no longer a regional battle, it had become a stage in the epic struggle for the fate of the Eastern Front. By the time winter began to thaw, in early 1942, both armies had been reshaped by months of attrition. German divisions stood weakened, their numbers thinned by frostbite, disease, and constant skirmishes. Romanian troops, exhausted and demoralized, clung to their positions with grim resolve despite staggering losses. Soviet defenders, though battered, remained firmly entrenched, their city scarred but unbroken. Sevastopol had survived the first true test of endurance, but the cost was counted in tens of thousands of lives. The battlefield around the fortress was littered with frozen corpses, rusting weapons, and the wreckage of shattered guns. Neither side had achieved decisive victory, yet both had endured suffering beyond measure. For Manstein, the lesson was clear: only overwhelming force could bring down the fortress. For the Soviets, the lesson was equally stark: only relentless endurance could keep it standing. As spring approached, both sides prepared for the next phase of the struggle. The winter of attrition had ended, but the siege of Sevastopol was far from over. While Sevastopol endured the hammering of German artillery through the winter of 1941-42, the Soviet High Command sought a bold way to relieve the pressure. The Black Sea Fleet, battered but unbroken, became the instrument of this strategy, tasked with striking at Axis positions elsewhere in Crimea. In late December 1941, Soviet planners launched one of the most daring counteroffensives of the campaign: amphibious landings on the eastern shores of the peninsula. The Kerch Strait, icy and windswept, became the stage for this risky gamble, where transports and warships carried divisions across treacherous waters. The idea was audacious: to open a new front that would force the Germans to divert troops away from Sevastopol. Troops embarked under cover of darkness, crammed into ships and landing craft, their rifles wrapped in cloth to shield them from salt and frost. Naval infantry stood shoulder to shoulder with regular army units, their black uniforms a stark contrast against the snow and sea spray. Sailors sang quiet songs as they sailed, aware they might never return from the voyage. Overhead, Soviet fighters buzzed low, their engines struggling in the bitter cold. The stage was set for a counterattack that could alter the fate of the siege. On December 26, 1941, Soviet troops stormed ashore near Kerch in an assault that caught the Axis by surprise. Waves of soldiers leapt from landing craft into icy surf, wading through waist-deep water under enemy fire. The landings were chaotic, with units scattered by currents and ships running aground on frozen beaches. Yet sheer determination carried them forward, as men clawed their way inland with grenades and rifles held above their heads. German and Romanian defenders, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, firing from makeshift positions on the cliffs. Soviet naval guns thundered from offshore, smashing enemy strongpoints and clearing paths for advancing infantry. The fighting quickly devolved into brutal clashes among dunes, villages, and frozen fields. Soviet reinforcements poured in behind the first wave, gradually securing a tenuous beachhead. For the first time in months, the Red Army had seized the initiative in Crimea. The landings at Kerch signaled that Sevastopol would not fight alone. Days later, another blow fell as Soviet forces launched a second amphibious landing at Feodosia. This ancient port city, with its stone walls and narrow streets, suddenly became the focus of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. Warships bombarded the harbour as transports unloaded troops directly onto the quays, often under fire from German artillery. Soviet soldiers surged through the streets, fighting house to house with submachine guns, grenades, and bayonets. The defenders, mostly Romanian units, resisted fiercely, but were soon overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault. Civilians huddled in basements as the city became a battleground of fire and rubble. By New Year's Eve, Feodosia was firmly in Soviet hands, its harbour once again flying the red banner. The capture of the city threatened to split Axis forces in Crimea, forcing Manstein to reconsider his entire deployment. For the first time, German supply lines were in jeopardy, vulnerable to disruption by Soviet forces operating from the east. The landings at Feodosia electrified Soviet morale, proving that the enemy could be driven back by daring and sacrifice. For Manstein, the Soviet landings created a crisis that demanded immediate action. His 11th Army, already strained by the Siege of Sevastopol, now faced the prospect of fighting on two fronts within the peninsula. German and Romanian divisions were rushed eastward, pulled from the siege lines and thrown into desperate battles on the Kerch Peninsula. Bitter fighting erupted across snow-covered fields, with Soviet troops dug into makeshift trenches and German units counterattacking with tanks and artillery. The Romanians bore the brunt of these early clashes, their formations shattered by relentless Soviet assaults. Manstein maneuvered his limited reserves with cold precision, determined to contain the Soviet threat before it could grow. The Luftwaffe, once grounded by weather, returned in force, bombing Soviet positions and sinking transports in the strait. Each day became a struggle to hold the line, with Axis forces stretched thin and Soviet reinforcements continuing to arrive by sea. The battle for Crimea had expanded beyond Sevastopol, transforming into a peninsula-wide struggle. The siege had become a contest of flexibility as much as endurance. Inside Sevastopol, the news of the landing spread like wildfire, igniting hope among the exhausted defenders. Soldiers in the trenches whispered that the Red Army was coming to their aid, that soon the Germans would be forced to retreat. Civilians, shivering in underground shelters, cheered when Soviet newspapers announced the victories at Kerch and Feodosia. Naval convoys grew bolder, slipping into the harbour with fresh troops, ammunition, and even tanks ferried across the Black Sea. Soviet officers reminded their men that they were not isolated, that the motherland had not abandoned them. The booming of naval guns offshore was a constant reminder of this renewed offensive spirit, yet alongside hope came grim realism, for the defenders knew that their relief depended on whether the new beachheads could be held. In the bunkers and command posts, commanders studied maps anxiously, tracing the tenuous lifelines that connected Sevastopol with the Eastern Front. For now, morale surged, and with it the will to resist. Sevastopol breathed again, strengthened by the knowledge that the fight was spreading beyond its walls. The Soviet counterattacks were not without staggering cost. Thousands of soldiers drowned in the icy waters of the Kerch Strait, their bodies carried away by unforgiving currents. Entire units were cut down on the beaches, their advance halted before it began. At Feodosia, house-to-house combat consumed lives by the hundreds, leaving streets choked with rubble and blood. Medical teams worked frantically in makeshift hospitals, overwhelmed by the tide of wounded staggering back from the front. Soviet transports, loaded with reinforcements and supplies, were sunk by German bombers, consigning entire companies to watery graves. Survivors described the landings as nightmares of chaos and fire, where survival depended on luck as much as courage. Yet for all the sacrifice, the gains were undeniable. Crimea was no longer under complete Axis control. Every mile of ground taken in Kerch and Feodosia meant relief for Sevastopol, however temporary. The price was enormous, but the Soviet command considered it a price worth paying. For Stalin, the symbolism of striking back was as important as the military effect. The broader strategic picture began to shift as the Soviet landings forced the Germans into a defensive posture. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to swift advances and decisive victories, now found itself pinned down in a grinding two-front struggle. Supplies had to be rerouted, reinforcements summoned from other sectors, and carefully laid plans delayed. Hitler fumed at the setbacks, demanding that Manstein crush the Soviet beachheads no matter the cost. Manstein responded with a counteroffensive in early 1942, using carefully coordinated artillery and airstrikes to push the Soviets back. Fierce battles raged across the Kerch Peninsula, with Soviet troops clinging to their positions under relentless attack. Despite their bravery, the Red Army eventually lost ground, forced into a defensive posture of its own. By spring, much of the territory gained at Feodosia was retaken by the Germans, though the Soviets managed to maintain a presence in Kerch. The counteroffensive had failed to liberate Sevastopol, but it had forced the Germans to bleed valuable men and resources. The stalemate deepened, and the siege endured. By the close of winter, the Soviet counterattacks had altered the character of the siege in profound ways. Sevastopol was no longer an isolated fortress under slow strangulation. It was now part of a dynamic battlefield stretching across the entire Crimean Peninsula. The Black Sea Fleet had proven its worth, delivering reinforcements and striking at the enemy in daring amphibious operations. Though costly and ultimately limited in their success, the landings at Kerch and Feodosia demonstrated Soviet resilience and the ability to strike back even in the darkest months of the war. For the Germans, the operations were a painful reminder that the Red Army could not be underestimated, even in defeat. For the Soviets, the sight of their flag flying once more in Feodosia became a symbol of defiance and survival. The siege lines around Sevastopol remained, but the pressure had shifted, buying the defenders time. In the cold light of spring, both sides prepared for the next phase of the struggle. The counterattacks from the sea had not broken the siege, but they had kept Sevastopol's heart beating. By the spring of 1942, the Crimean battlefield had become a chessboard of crises for the Axis. Sevastopol still held defiantly in the west, its guns roaring day and night, while in the east Soviet forces clung stubbornly to the Kerch Peninsula. For Erich von Manstein, commander of the 11th Army, this meant his divisions were stretched to the breaking point across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. His German infantry, weary from months of siege warfare, now found themselves fighting defensive battles against fresh Soviet reinforcements arriving by sea. Romanian allies, tasked with holding vast sectors, suffered heavy losses, their morale shaken by the ferocity of the Red Army's winter offensives. Supplies were thin, fuel scarce, and ammunition had to be rationed carefully, forcing commanders to prioritize which sectors could fight and which could only endure. The balance of power seemed to tilt dangerously toward the Soviets, who were determined to maintain their foothold in eastern Crimea. Yet Manstein was not a general who surrendered to circumstance. Cold, calculating, and endlessly resourceful, he prepared to reverse his fortunes with one decisive stroke. The crisis that threatened to unravel his army would become the prelude to one of his most famous victories. The Soviets, emboldened by their landings at Kerch and Feodosia, had reinforced their presence on the peninsula throughout the winter. The Crimean front, commanded by General Dmitry Kozlov, fielded nearly 250,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft. Their mission was ambitious: drive westward, relieve Sevastopol, and expel the Axis from Crimea entirely. Soviet planners believed they had numerical superiority and the advantage of fresh reinforcements ferried across the Kerch Strait. Yet beneath this confidence lay fatal flaws, for the Soviet forces were poorly coordinated, logistically strained, and divided by command rivalries. Their troops dug into shallow trenches across the barren steppe, exposed to air attack and lacking sufficient artillery support. Ammunition dumps were scattered and vulnerable, while supply convoys often arrived late or not at all. German intelligence, aided by aerial reconnaissance, noted these weaknesses with growing interest. Manstein saw not a looming Soviet victory, but a target ripe for destruction. His plan was bold, simple, and ruthless to crush the Crimean front in a single devastating blow. The operation, codenamed Trappenjagd, Bustard Hunt, was launched in May 1942. Manstein massed his forces with surgical precision, concentrating his best divisions for a hammer strike against the Soviet front. Stuka dive bombers from Richthofen's 8th Air Corps roared overhead in coordinated waves, their bombs tearing open trenches and igniting ammunition stores. German artillery, carefully positioned along ridges, unleashed a deafening barrage that shredded Soviet lines. Infantry and panzers surged forward through the smoke, striking weak points identified in advance by reconnaissance. The Soviets, caught in the open, were stunned by the speed and violence of the assault. Communication broke down almost immediately, with frontline units cut off from their commanders and collapsing under relentless pressure. Entire Soviet regiments dissolved as German spearheads drove deep into their rear, encircling strongpoints and sealing escape routes. Panic spread quickly across the steppe, with soldiers abandoning their positions in desperate attempts to flee. Within hours, the carefully prepared Soviet front was disintegrating into chaos. Manstein's gamble had paid off, and the trap was closing with deadly precision. The Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies proved decisive in the battle. Stukas and Heinkel bombers struck relentlessly at Soviet columns, turning retreat into massacre as roads clogged with burning vehicles. Soviet aircraft tried to contest the skies, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and quickly swept aside. German pilots hunted supply convoys and troop concentrations, leaving no refuge for the battered Red Army. On the ground, panzers slashed through gaps in the line, encircling entire Soviet formations before they could regroup. Infantry followed, mopping up isolated pockets of resistance with grenades, machine guns, and flamethrowers. Romanian divisions, though less well equipped, advanced on the flanks, capturing prisoners and securing territory. Soviet strongpoints were bypassed, then crushed in detail by concentrated artillery fire. The pace of the German advance stunned both friend and foe, unraveling the Soviet position faster than even Manstein had anticipated. In less than a week, the Crimean front was collapsing into ruin. The once proud Soviet foothold in Kerch was being wiped from the map. The human cost of Trappenjagd was staggering, a testament to both the ferocity of the assault and the unpreparedness of the defenders. Nearly 170,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the operation, their weapons and equipment strewn across the steppe. Thousands more drowned in the Kerch Strait, attempting to flee back to the Taman Peninsula under German artillery and air attack. Entire Soviet divisions ceased to exist, their banners lost, their commanders taken prisoner or killed. Survivors described scenes of chaos, with retreating soldiers trampled under tanks or burned alive in strafed convoys. German troops, hardened by months of siege warfare, were astonished by the scale of their victory, marching past mountains of abandoned Soviet equipment. Romanian forces, often derided as second-rate, took pride in their share of the success, proving their worth in the Axis alliance. Manstein's meticulous planning had yielded not just victory, but annihilation. The Soviet attempt to relieve Sevastopol had ended in catastrophe. For the defenders inside the fortress, the hope of rescue was extinguished almost overnight. With the Crimean front destroyed, Manstein turned his full attention back to Sevastopol. The fortress, which had endured through winter and Soviet counterattacks, now stood alone, cut off from major relief efforts. The destruction of the Kerch landing freed Axis divisions, artillery and aircraft for the final assault. Heavy siege weapons, including the massive Karl mortars and the monstrous Dora railway gun, were prepared for deployment against the city. Manstein envisioned a systematic operation, one that would combine relentless bombardment with coordinated infantry attacks. He knew the fortress would not fall quickly, but he believed he now had the means to break it. Supplies flowed into Axis lines, reinforcements arrived, and morale rose after months of attritional stagnation. The soldiers of the 11th Army, once stretched thin and defensive, now marched with renewed confidence. The pendulum of fortune had swung decisively back to the Axis. For Sevastopol the storm was gathering, darker and more terrible than anything it had faced before. Inside Sevastopol, the consequences of Manstein's victory at Kerch were felt immediately. Soviet commanders, once buoyed by the hope of relief, now faced the grim reality of isolation. The garrison, still numbering over 100,000, prepared for the inevitability of another massive German assault. Ammunition stockpiles were counted and recounted, food rations tightened, and hospitals expanded into every available underground chamber. The Black Sea Fleet continued to bring supplies by sea, but convoys now faced even heavier Luftwaffe attacks. Civilians braced for renewed bombardment, their spirits shaken by the collapse of the Soviet front in Kerch. Soldiers swore to defend the fortress to the last, but privately some wondered how long they could endure. Soviet propaganda continued to trumpet defiance, insisting Sevastopol would never fall. Yet beneath the slogans lay an uneasy recognition that the fortress now stood alone against the concentrated might of Manstein's army. The battle had shifted from hope of relief to sheer survival. For Manstein, the destruction of the Kerch landing was not merely a military success, but a demonstration of his strategic genius. He had transformed a moment of crisis into triumph, seizing the initiative with boldness and precision. His reputation within the Wehrmacht soared, admired even by his rivals, as the man who had crushed 250,000 Soviets in a single campaign. Yet he remained coldly focused, unwilling to celebrate prematurely, for the hardest battle still lay ahead. Sevastopol, with its fortresses and underground tunnels, would require more than clever maneuvers. It would demand a colossal application of firepower and endurance. The victory at Kerch had brought him the freedom to concentrate, but it had also raised expectations from Hitler himself. Now the Führer demanded the fortress be taken, no matter the cost, as proof of German supremacy on the southern front. Manstein accepted the challenge with calm resolve, his eyes fixed on the fortress city that had defied him through winter. The crisis had passed, the recovery complete, and the final battle for Sevastopol was about to begin. With the Soviet Crimean front crushed at Kerch and Manstein preparing for the final storm on Sevastopol, the skies above the peninsula became a battlefield of decisive importance. The Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps, commanded by General Wolfram von Richthofen, shifted its focus to the destruction of Soviet supply lines and the isolation of the fortress city. Richthofen, nephew of the famous Red Baron, was a ruthless practitioner of aerial warfare, believing that relentless bombing could cripple both armies and cities alike. His squadrons of Junkers Juicy, 87 Stuka dive bombers, Henkel He 111 medium bombers, and Messerschmitt Boffe 109 fighters blanketed the skies with German dominance. Soviet air units, flying outdated I-153 biplanes and I-16 fighters alongside newer Yak and MiG aircraft, struggled to mount meaningful resistance. From the first sorties, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had achieved overwhelming superiority in numbers, training, and coordination. Soviet pilots fought with bravery, but lacked the experience and resources to challenge German control. Every flight became a gamble with death, every convoy across the Black Sea a moving target. Sevastopol's survival now depended not only on its guns and walls, but on whether supplies could slip through skies ruled by the enemy. The Luftwaffe's strategy was comprehensive, striking not only the fortress itself, but the arteries that fed it. Convoys sailing from Novorossiysk and Tupops across the Black Sea were hunted mercilessly by Stukas and torpedo bombers. Merchant ships carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements often never reached Sevastopol, their blackened hulks sinking beneath the waves. Soviet destroyers and cruisers, attempting to escort these lifelines, became targets themselves, dodging bombs that fell in endless succession. On land, German bombers pounded railway junctions, fuel depots, and forward supply bases, severing the flow of reinforcements to Crimea. Airfields inside the fortress were cratered repeatedly, forcing Soviet aircraft to disperse or operate from makeshift strips carved into the countryside. Richthofen's philosophy of total air dominance meant that no target was too small or insignificant. Trucks, horse-drawn wagons, even marching columns of men were fair game. Every successful strike tightened the noose around Sevastopol, depriving its defenders of the means to continue the fight. Soviet commanders grew increasingly desperate, knowing their fortress could not endure without steady resupply. The Luftwaffe's relentless pressure turned Crimea into a killing ground where movement by day was nearly suicidal. Inside Sevastopol, the effects of German air superiority were felt daily with devastating clarity. The city, already scarred by artillery bombardment, now endured constant aerial raids that reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Civilians huddled in cellars and caves, their lives measured in the intervals between sirens and the thunder of explosions. Hospitals, though marked with Red Cross symbols, were bombed repeatedly, their wards collapsing onto the wounded within. Water pipelines were shattered, forcing residents to draw from wells under threat of strafing runs. Food convoys arriving in the harbor were struck with terrifying precision, setting ships ablaze and scattering burning oil across the water. Sailors risked their lives unloading supplies under air attack, racing against the firestorm from above. Anti-aircraft crews fought tirelessly, their guns hammering into the sky, but the sheer weight of the Luftwaffe was overwhelming. Each raid forced defenders to expend precious ammunition, even as replacements became harder to secure. The psychological toll was immense, as sleepless nights and constant fear gnawed at soldiers and civilians alike. Sevastopol had become a city under perpetual siege from the sky. The Soviet Air Force, though battered, refused to surrender the skies without a fight. Brave pilots of the Black Sea Fleet Air Arm took off daily from primitive runways, their aircraft patched together with whatever parts could be salvaged. Flying outdated Polikarpov biplanes against sleek German fighters, they fought with reckless courage, often outnumbered 5-1. Soviet bombers attempted daring raids on Axis airfields, occasionally scoring hits that destroyed German aircraft on the ground. Night bombing missions became a hallmark of their resistance, with small groups of planes harassing German positions under cover of darkness. Female pilots, the famed night witches, flew fragile biplanes over enemy camps, dropping bombs with unnerving accuracy. Yet for every success, losses were heavy, with pilots forced to parachute into the sea or burn inside their cockpits. Ground crews worked without rest, hauling munitions by hand and patching holes with sheet metal scavenged from wrecks. The courage of these flyers inspired the defenders of Sevastopol, who cheered when Soviet aircraft clawed their way into the sky. But bravery alone could not change the balance of power. The skies belonged to the Luftwaffe, and every Soviet sortie was a fight against impossible odds. Richthofen's campaign reached a crescendo in May 1942, when preparations for the final assault on Sevastopol began in earnest. The Luftwaffe unleashed massive bombing raids designed to flatten fortifications and break the defenders' will. Stukas dove in screaming packs, their sirens howling as they released bombs on Soviet coastal batteries. Henkel bombers blanketed defensive positions with high explosives, while Junkers Ju-88s targeted ammunition depots hidden in ravines. The scale of the bombardment was unprecedented in the southern theater, with thousands of tons of ordnance dropped in just days. Soviet gunners at Fort Maxim Gorky and other strongpoints fired defiantly back, their shells sometimes blasting German aircraft from the sky. Yet for every bomber shot down, dozens more appeared, filling the air with the roar of engines and the whistle of falling bombs. Entire hillsides were scarred and blackened, their fortifications shaken but not destroyed. Richthofen believed no fortress could withstand such fury for long. For the men in the bunkers, the air war was no longer just a strategic contest, it was survival beneath a sky on fire. The impact of Luftwaffe control extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the daily rhythm of life inside the fortress. Convoys arriving by night brought supplies under constant fear of air attack, their decks lit by the glow of burning wrecks. Dock workers labored frantically, unloading crates before dawn, knowing daylight would bring another storm of bombs. Civilians scavenged among ruins for wood and food, dodging unexploded ordnance that littered the streets. Children were evacuated to caves, where families lived in darkness, their world reduced to whispers and shadows. Soldiers grew used to the ceaseless thunder above, but their nerves frayed under the unending strain. Every delay in supply meant fewer shells for the artillery, fewer bullets for the rifles, fewer rations for the garrison. The Luftwaffe's strategy was not only to destroy physically, but to exhaust psychologically, to convince defenders that resistance was futile. Yet Sevastopol endured, its people stubbornly clinging to life amid the ruins. The fortress was still standing, but every day of air raids made survival harder to imagine. Manstein, ever the strategist, exploited the Luftwaffe's dominance as a critical component of his siege. He knew that without supplies, Sevastopol could not endure, no matter how strong its walls or brave its defenders. The cooperation between the 11th Army and Richthofen's Air Corps became a model of combined arms warfare, synchronizing artillery barrages with aerial bombardments. German spotter planes circled high above, guiding artillery fire onto bunkers and fortresses with pinpoint accuracy. Luftwaffe reconnaissance mapped every trench, gun pit and supply dump, feeding intelligence directly to Manstein's headquarters. This seamless coordination multiplied the effectiveness of the siege, turning every Soviet position into a target under constant observation. For the Germans, air power was not just a tool, but the key to victory, grinding down the fortress day by day. For the Soviets, every convoy that slipped through the gauntlet became a triumph, every plane that rose into the sky an act of defiance. The struggle above Crimea mirrored the struggle below, relentless, merciless, and decisive. The air war was the invisible siege that made every other assault possible. By June 1942, the Luftwaffe had achieved near-total dominance over the skies of Crimea. Soviet resupply efforts were crippled, their convoys reduced to shadows of what they had once been. Airfields inside Sevastopol lay in ruins, their surviving aircraft hidden in gullies or destroyed on the ground. The Black Sea Fleet continued to fight, but its movements were shackled by constant air attack. The defenders inside the fortress endured hunger, thirst, and the thunder of daily raids, their endurance stretched to its absolute limits. German troops, watching the sky filled with their own aircraft, felt confidence rise, certain that the end was approaching. For Manstein, this dominance meant the moment had arrived to launch his final decisive offensive. For the Soviets, the air war had become a nightmare from which there was no escape. The sky itself had turned against them, leaving only the earth and the sea to sustain their defense. The fortress of Sevastopol still stood, but the Luftwaffe had ensured it stood alone, cut off and vulnerable. The stage was set for the greatest assault the Black Sea had ever seen. By the summer of 1942, Sevastopol had become a city transformed into a vast subterranean world of survival. Streets once filled with markets and parades now lay silent, cratered by bombs and lined with collapsed buildings. Civilians, soldiers, and sailors alike retreated underground, finding refuge in the limestone caves and tunnels carved deep beneath the hills. Families huddled together in the damp darkness, their lives measured by the muffled thunder of artillery overhead. The city's famous catacombs, once used for storage, now housed thousands of people living in conditions of constant fear and deprivation. Oil lamps cast dim light on rough stone walls, their flickering glow barely keeping the shadows at bay. Air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the stench of unwashed bodies crammed together in narrow passageways. Children whispered songs to calm themselves, their voices drowned by the distant echo of explosions. For many, these underground shelters became both prison and sanctuary, the only barrier between life and death. Above ground, Sevastopol was a fortress. Below ground, it was a city of ghosts enduring the siege in silence. At the heart of Sevastopol's defense stood its great coastal batteries, manned by gunners who became legends in their own time. Fort Maxim Gorky, carved into solid rock, housed twin 305mm guns, capable of hurling shells nearly 30 kilometers. Each shot shook the earth, sending reverberations across the harbor and rattling windows in the underground shelters. The gunners, hardened men of the Red Navy, lived in the fortress like iron guardians, working in shifts around the clock. Their barracks lay deep underground, connected to ammunition lifts that carried shells the size of small cars up to the turrets. German artillery and Luftwaffe raids tried endlessly to silence the fortress, but its guns roared back with stubborn defiance. Smaller batteries, scattered across the coastline, added their fire, weaving a web of steel that kept Axis troops pinned down. Each fort was a community in itself, with kitchens, sleeping quarters, and medical rooms dug into the rock. Crews formed bonds stronger than family, knowing that survival depended on absolute trust. The thunder of these batteries was more than firepower, it was the heartbeat of the fortress. Hospitals, too, burrowed deep underground, became scenes of ceaseless toil and tragedy. Surgeons worked by the light of oil lamps or flickering electric bulbs, their hands steady despite the trembling ground above. Stretchers filled with wounded streamed in without pause, carried down stairwells slick with blood and sweat. Supplies were scarce, forcing doctors to improvise with crude instruments and makeshift bandages torn from civilian clothing. Operations were performed with little or no anesthesia, the screams of patients muffled by the walls, but never forgotten. Nurses, many barely out of their teens, worked until collapse, their uniforms stained permanently red. The wounded lay on rows of cots, or directly on stone floors, whispering prayers or calling for families they might never see again. In these hidden wards, the struggle was not only against wounds, but against infection, hunger, and despair. Despite the horror, there were moments of quiet courage, songs sung softly to calm the injured, letters dictated to nurses, promises that the fortress would endure. The hospitals beneath Sevastopol were not only places of suffering, but also of unyielding humanity. They were proof that even under siege, life refused to surrender. Food shortages gnawed at the garrison and civilians alike, each meal a reminder of the city's isolation. Bread rations shrank to ounces per day, often stretched with sawdust or acorn flour to make them last. Meat was rare, with horses slaughtered, and even stray animals becoming meals for hungry families. Fish from the Black Sea provided occasional relief, but fishing boats risked destruction by German aircraft. Children were given priority for milk and soup, though even these portions grew thinner as weeks turned to months. Soldiers in the trenches chewed on hard biscuits and tins of preserved fish, their stomachs never full. Civilians bartered clothing and jewelry for scraps, each trade a gamble in survival. Water too became precious, as pipelines shattered and wells were targeted by enemy bombardment. Canteens were guarded jealously, every drop measured as though it were liquid gold. Hunger stalked Sevastopol as surely as the enemy guns outside its walls. Despite the constant privation, the city did not lose its spirit of defiance. Propaganda posters adorned tunnel walls, urging citizens to hold on with slogans like "Sevastopol will not fall." Loudspeakers carried stirring speeches and martial songs, their echoes bouncing through the caves. Soldiers returning from the front were greeted as heroes, their worn uniforms covered in soot and grime but their heads held high. Civilians shared what little they had with the garrison, knitting socks, delivering water, or simply offering words of encouragement. Children too young to fight played at being soldiers in the dim corridors, their laughter briefly piercing the gloom. At night, when the bombing lulled, neighbors gathered to sing folk songs that reminded them of life before the war. The NKVD maintained strict order, punishing defeatism harshly, but for many discipline was less a burden than a shield against despair. Sevastopol became more than a fortress. It became a symbol of unity, where every citizen bore the weight of defense. Each day endured was proof that the city still lived, even as the siege sought to crush it. The fortress was not only defended by guns but by the will of its people. Life in the trenches, and on the front lines, was a nightmare of exhaustion and constant vigilance. Soviet infantry rotated in and out of positions carved into ravines and hillsides, their bodies hardened by endless bombardment. Nights were spent in dugouts, damp and infested with lice, while days brought relentless artillery fire from German guns. Soldiers clutched their rifles through freezing winds, their fingers numb and cracked from frost and powder burns. Ammunition was rationed, with strict orders to fire only when targets were certain. Patrols ventured out at night, moving silently through no man's land, knives and grenades in hand. Casualties were dragged back through trenches, their cries echoing across the battlefield. Relief came only in short intervals when soldiers returned to the city to rest in underground barracks before being called forward again. Naval infantry, feared for their black uniforms and reputation as Black Death, led counterattacks with unmatched ferocity. Every soldier knew that retreat meant the fall of the fortress, and so they clung to their posts with grim determination. In Sevastopol, the front line was not a place but a way of life. The Black Sea Fleet, though battered by air raids, remained a lifeline for the city. Warships braved bomb-streaked skies to deliver ammunition, reinforcements, and food into the besieged harbor. Destroyers and submarines slipped through under cover of darkness, unloading supplies before disappearing back into the sea. Sailors carried crates onto the docks under bombardment, knowing each run might be their last. Many ships were lost, sunk in fiery spectacles that lit the horizon for miles, their crews swallowed by the sea. Survivors returned to duty without hesitation, driven by duty and the knowledge that Sevastopol depended on them. Anti-aircraft batteries around the harbor blazed constantly, their tracers stitching the sky as bombs rained down. The fleet also provided fire support, its guns thundering inland to hammer German positions threatening the city. The sight of Soviet warships in the harbor was a source of pride for defenders, proof that the fortress was not entirely alone. Each successful voyage was celebrated as a victory, each sinking mourned as a tragedy. The fleet's sacrifice was as much a part of the siege as the soldiers in the trenches. By mid-1942, Sevastopol had become a fortress under siege in every sense of the word. Above ground, ruins testified to months of bombardment, while underground, life persisted in shadows and hardship. Civilians lived like troglodytes, soldiers fought like machines, and doctors worked like saints among the dying. The roar of coastal guns, the howl of bombers, and the cries of children merged into the soundtrack of survival. The city endured not only as a military bastion, but as a human community bound together by suffering and resilience. Every man, woman, and child carried the weight of history on their shoulders, knowing their endurance would echo beyond their lifetimes. German observers marveled at the stubbornness of the defense, while Soviet propaganda declared Sevastopol immortal. In truth, the fortress was bleeding slowly, its lifelines cut one by one, yet its spirit remained unbroken. The siege was not only a battle of armies, but a battle of wills. Sevastopol stood defiant, a fortress city under fire, refusing to fall even as the storm gathered for its final fury. By the spring of 1942, Manstein and his 11th Army prepared to unleash the heaviest concentration of siege weaponry the world had ever seen. Sevastopol's defenses, carved into rock and steel, demanded more than conventional artillery or infantry assaults. To break them, the Germans gathered weapons of staggering size, machines that seemed more like instruments of mythology than tools of war. Chief among them was the Schwerer Gustav, nicknamed Dora, a railway gun, so massive it required thousands of men to assemble. Alongside Dora came the Karl Gerrit mortars, 6 monstrous self-propelled howitzers firing shells heavier than cars. Added to this arsenal were hundreds of heavy field guns, howitzers, and rocket launchers, all calibrated for the task of pulverizing Soviet fortresses. Above, the Luftwaffe prepared to saturate the city with bombing raids of unprecedented scale. It was siege warfare transformed into spectacle, a demonstration of industrial might, directed at a single target. Sevastopol was not merely to be taken, it was to be shattered. The assembly of Dora alone was an engineering feat that captured the imagination of both friend and foe. The gun, weighing 1,350 tons, traveled in pieces on dozens of railway cars before being reassembled on specially constructed tracks. Its barrel, nearly 30 meters long, could hurl a 7-ton shell over 40 kilometers, striking with the force of an earthquake. Thousands of laborers and engineers toiled for weeks to prepare its firing site, building embankments, laying reinforced tracks, and camouflaging the monster from Soviet reconnaissance. When Dora finally stood assembled, its presence inspired awe among German troops, who posed for photographs beside its wheels. Firing the weapon required a crew of hundreds, from loaders to rangefinders, each movement rehearsed with meticulous discipline. The shells themselves had to be hoisted by cranes and slid into the breech with precision, a process that took hours for each shot. When it fired, the ground shook for miles, and a mushroom cloud of dust rose where the shell struck. Soviet defenders could do little to counter it, for its range placed it beyond the reach of their artillery. Dora became a symbol of German determination to annihilate Sevastopol by sheer mechanical force. The Karl-Gerät mortars, though smaller than Dora, brought devastation of a different kind. Mounted on tracked chassis, these 600mm weapons were mobile enough to be positioned close to the front lines, each fired shells weighing over 2 tons, capable of obliterating concrete bunkers in a single strike. Their crews, seasoned artillerymen, worked tirelessly to keep the mortars supplied, each shot requiring enormous effort. The weapons belched fire and smoke as they launched their projectiles in high arcs, the shells descending like meteors into Soviet strongholds. Soviet soldiers, crouched in bunkers, recalled the terrifying roar, followed by the crushing collapse of walls and ceilings. One mortar shell could turn an underground chamber into a tomb, burying dozens alive in seconds. Engineers tried to reinforce bunkers against these blows, but even the strongest steel doors buckled under repeated impacts. For the men firing them, the mortars were instruments of immense pride, nicknamed with affection despite their grotesque size. For the defenders, they were the very embodiment of despair, proof that no fortress was beyond the reach of German firepower. Yet it was not only these titans of steel that battered Sevastopol, but the relentless chorus of conventional artillery. Over 600 heavy guns were deployed around the city, their barrels lined across ridges and valleys in an unbroken arc of fire. Howitzers of every caliber hurled shells day and night, their thunder rolling across the Black Sea. German gunners fired until their hands blistered, rotating in shifts to maintain the ceaseless bombardment. Supply convoys brought endless crates of ammunition, stacked in hills around the gun positions, awaiting their turn to be hurled toward the fortress. Every Soviet position, from coastal batteries to small trenches, was plotted on maps and targeted systematically. The ground quaked constantly, as though the earth itself had become an accomplice to the siege. For soldiers on both sides, the noise became a permanent companion, a roar that deafened ears and rattled bones. Civilians underground marked time not by days, but by the rhythm of shelling, knowing silence only meant another storm was about to begin. The artillery war was total, leaving no corner of Sevastopol untouched. Above the battlefield, the Luftwaffe added its own layer of destruction. Richthofen Stukas dove in shrieking formations, releasing bombs with terrifying accuracy onto fortresses, ships, and supply dumps. Hinkel and Junkers bombers carpeted defensive lines, shaking tunnels and collapsing trenches. Fighter squadrons swept the skies clean of Soviet aircraft, ensuring near-total air superiority for German operations. Soviet pilots rose defiantly, but their numbers dwindled with each passing day, their machines falling in flames to the relentless Messerschmitts. Anti-aircraft batteries in Sevastopol blazed away, filling the skies with bursts of flak, but their ammunition was precious and limited. Bombers returned again and again, often striking the same positions until nothing recognizable remained. For defenders in bunkers, the roar of dive bombers became a sound of dread, the herald of destruction plunging from the clouds. Ships in the harbour were targeted mercilessly, many sunk before they could unload their cargo. Richthofen saw the siege as a laboratory for air power, a chance to prove that bombing alone could crush even the strongest fortress. For Sevastopol, the skies themselves had turned into a weapon wielded by the enemy. The combined effect of this bombardment was apocalyptic. Hillsides were stripped bare, their trees splintered into toothpicks by shellfire. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath clouds of dust, their outlines erased from the map. Fortifications designed to withstand ordinary artillery cracked and collapsed under the weight of super-heavy shells. Underground tunnels shook violently, collapsing ceilings onto soldiers and civilians alike. Fires raged uncontrolled, fueled by shattered fuel depots and burning ships in the harbor. The very landscape of Sevastopol changed, ravines filled with rubble and new craters yawning like open wounds. The psychological toll was immense, as defenders realized nowhere was safe from the German arsenal. Letters from the front spoke of the earth itself turning against them, as if the city was being swallowed whole. Yet despite the destruction, resistance continued, the fortress still bristling with guns. The bombardment was intended to destroy morale, but it only hardened the resolve of those still standing. Among the defenders, stories of endurance circulated like legends, sustaining hope amid the firestorm. Gunners at Fort Maxim Gorky manned their posts even as shells from Dora tore into their armored turrets. Naval infantry, black-clad and fearless, launched counterattacks from tunnels that German artillery had tried in vain to seal. Doctors performed surgeries under bombardment, their operating tables trembling with each concussion. Civilians risked their lives carrying water and food to soldiers, moving through smoke-filled streets under constant fire. Children were born in underground shelters, their first cries mingling with the crash of distant explosions. Each act of survival became a victory. Each day endured a defiance of German firepower. Soviet propaganda broadcast these stories, declaring the fortress unbreakable despite the titanic assault. German observers, however, noted with frustration that even the heaviest guns could not silence Sevastopol completely. The fortress bled, but it did not collapse. The giants of siege warfare had struck with fury, but the defenders still lived. For Manstein, the deployment of these colossal weapons was both a triumph and a necessity. He knew that without them, Sevastopol's fortresses could have resisted for months, draining his army and tying down vital resources. With them, he believed victory was inevitable, a matter of grinding the defenders into dust. The spectacle of Dora and the Karl mortars was meant to intimidate, but it was also a demonstration to Hitler of German military might. Photographs and reports were sent to Berlin, showcasing the technological marvels at work in Crimea. Yet the reality on the ground was far grimmer, as each shell claimed lives and turned the city into ruins. The fortress had endured the heaviest bombardment in history, yet its guns still fired, its soldiers still fought, and its people still resisted. The giants had roared, but the battle was not over. Manstein prepared for the next phase, knowing that artillery alone would not secure victory. The giants of siege warfare had opened the door, but it would be blood and infantry that walked through it. By early June 1942, Erich von Manstein was ready to deliver the decisive blow against Sevastopol. The code name was Sturfang, sturgeon catch, chosen to symbolize a sweep both vast and final. Months of preparation had concentrated an arsenal unprecedented in modern siege warfare, over 200,000 German and Romanian troops, 1,300 artillery pieces, 6 Karl mortars, and the colossal Dora railway gun. The Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps, commanded by Wolfram von Richthofen, stood poised with hundreds of bombers and fighters to pound the city into submission. Ammunition stockpiles stretched for kilometers, a forest of crates ready to feed the guns in a storm of fire. Engineers had charted every trench and bunker, every ravine and ridge, using reconnaissance photos and prisoner interrogations. Axis units rehearsed assaults, moving in coordination with artillery barrages designed to peel open Soviet defenses layer by layer. Manstein's plan was methodical: relentless bombardment, concentrated infantry attacks, and armored support where terrain permitted. For the soldiers waiting in their foxholes, the scale of preparation was both reassuring and terrifying. The fortress was about to face the full weight of German might. The assault began on June 2nd with an artillery bombardment of apocalyptic intensity. Hundreds of guns fired in synchronized waves, their shells howling through the air before slamming into Soviet positions with crushing force. Dora thundered, its 7-ton shells tearing craters wide enough to swallow entire houses. The Karl mortars joined in, their massive projectiles pulverizing bunkers and collapsing underground galleries. Stukas dove from the clouds in shrieking cascades, dropping bombs that turned ridgelines into seas of smoke and fire. German gunners worked ceaselessly, rotating crews to keep the barrage continuous day and night. Hillsides were leveled, fortifications crumbled, and the earth shook under the sheer weight of destruction. Soviet trenches disappeared beneath waves of dust and rubble, their defenders buried alive or blasted into silence. The sky over Sevastopol glowed orange at night, lit by fires that burned without pause. For 8 days, the bombardment continued without respite, the heaviest in the history of the Eastern Front. Sevastopol was being battered into ruins, yet still its defenders clung to life beneath the storm. On June 7th, Manstein unleashed the infantry assault, sending his divisions forward behind the rolling barrages. German regiments advanced in waves, storming trenches that had been reduced to charred earth. Engineers cut through barbed wire and minefields, clearing paths under heavy fire from Soviet survivors. The Romanians, assigned to hold secondary sectors and support the main thrusts, pushed forward with determination despite mounting casualties. Soviet defenders emerged from bunkers, blackened by smoke, firing machine guns and throwing grenades with desperate resolve. Naval infantry counterattacked in sudden bursts, their black uniforms a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in trenches and dugouts, bayonets clashing in brutal, intimate struggles. The battlefield became a nightmare of shattered bodies and crumbling fortifications, fought meter by bloody meter. Despite the fury of resistance, the Axis gained ground, their momentum fueled by superior firepower. The final offensive had begun in earnest, and the fortress was reeling under its weight. The northern sector of Sevastopol saw some of the fiercest fighting, where German troops aimed to seize key fortifications along the Belbek Valley. Fort Stalin and Fort Lenin, heavily armed and manned by determined Soviet garrisons, became focal points of the assault. German artillery hammered them for days, but when infantry stormed forward, they were met with a storm of bullets and grenades. Assault groups carrying flamethrowers and satchel charges fought room by room through bunkers half buried in rubble. Soviet defenders refused to surrender, often fighting to the last man in chambers filled with smoke and fire. The 132nd Infantry Division reported entire companies wiped out in the attempt to seize a single bunker. Romanians on the flank struggled to keep pace, suffering grievous losses under counterattacks from Soviet reserves. Each position taken became a graveyard, won only after hours of slaughter and relentless fire. By the second week of June, The Belbek defences were collapsing, but at staggering cost to both sides. The northern sector had become a furnace of blood, smoke, and iron. To the east, Sapun Ridge became another crucible of the battle. Rising like a natural wall before the approaches to the city, the ridge was honeycombed with Soviet trenches, bunkers, and artillery. German battalions attacked repeatedly, advancing up the slopes under covering fire from mortars and Stukas. Each assault was met by Soviet counterfire, machine guns scything through attackers as shells rained down from concealed guns. The slopes became a wasteland of craters, smoke, and shattered bodies, with neither side willing to yield. German pioneers blasted bunkers with explosives, while Soviet soldiers fought back with bayonets in brutal close combat. The ridge changed hands multiple times, each exchange costing hundreds of lives. By mid-June, the Germans had gained a foothold, but the defenders still clung stubbornly to key positions. Sapun Ridge stood as a symbol of Sevastopol's unyielding resistance, even under the heaviest assault. Manstein understood that breaking it was essential to cracking the fortress's spine. The fight for Sapun was nothing less than a battle within a battle. Throughout the offensive, the Luftwaffe maintained relentless pressure from the skies. Richthofen's Air Corps flew thousands of sorties, striking everything from heavy batteries to supply dumps. Soviet convoys attempting to cross the Black Sea were bombed mercilessly, their ships sinking in plumes of smoke and fire. Inside the fortress, airfields were obliterated, leaving surviving Soviet aircraft grounded or destroyed. Anti-aircraft crews fought valiantly, their guns blazing against endless waves of bombers, but their ammunition dwindled with each passing day. Civilians, forced into underground shelters, lived in terror of the sudden roar of dive bombers overhead. Hospitals were struck, ships in harbour sunk, and entire districts reduced to rubble. Yet even under constant aerial attack, the fortress still fired back, its coastal guns blasting German positions. Soviet commanders clung to hope that reinforcements might arrive from the Caucasus, but the air war had severed their lifelines. Richthofen's bombers made certain that Sevastopol was truly alone. The skies were German, and they rained destruction without mercy. Amid the carnage, human stories of courage and suffering emerged with heartbreaking clarity. Soviet soldiers fought until their last cartridges were spent, then charged with bayonets or grenades clasped in their hands. Civilians carried ammunition to the front lines, stumbling through smoking ruins under artillery fire. Nurses in underground hospitals worked without pause, their wards overflowing with wounded whose moans echoed through the tunnels. German soldiers, hardened by months of war, described the fighting as the fiercest they had ever endured. Romanian units, often maligned as second-rate, won grudging respect by holding their ground against desperate Soviet counterattacks. Prisoners were rare, for both sides fought with a ferocity that left little room for mercy. Letters from the front spoke of landscapes unrecognizable, transformed into moonscapes of dust and fire. Survivors described the smell of cordite, blood and smoke mingling into a stench that seemed permanent. In this inferno, the line between soldier and civilian blurred, for all lived and died in the same storm. Sevastopol had become less a city than a battlefield, consuming everything within it. By late June, the German offensive pressed ever deeper into Sevastopol's defences. Fort after fort fell to the combined weight of artillery, bombers, and infantry assaults. Soviet units fought stubbornly, but were worn down by the sheer scale of Axis firepower. Coastal batteries that had once dominated the seas were silenced one by one, their turrets destroyed or captured. German banners were raised over positions once thought impregnable, signalling that the fortress was beginning to fracture. Manstein observed with satisfaction, convinced that the end was now within reach. Yet even in defeat, Soviet resistance remained unbroken, forcing the Germans to fight for every bunker and every street. The cost was immense, with casualties mounting on both sides at a rate that shocked even seasoned veterans. The final offensive had begun, and Sevastopol was staggering under its fury. But the fortress was not yet dead, and the battle was far from finished. By the third week of June 1942, the northern defences of Sevastopol had become the primary target of Manstein's fury. The German 11th Army concentrated its efforts on the Belbek Valley, where Fort Stalin, Fort Lenin, and the mighty Fort Maxim Gorky formed an iron shield. These fortifications were not mere bunkers, but subterranean fortresses, dug deep into rock and connected by tunnels stretching for kilometers. Each was armed with heavy guns, machine posts, and reinforced walls capable of withstanding ordinary bombardments. For months they had defied Axis assaults, their garrisons refusing to yield even under relentless fire. Now, under the concentrated weight of artillery, bombers, and ground attacks, the forts faced their ultimate trial. German and Romanian divisions moved into position, supported by pioneers carrying flamethrowers, explosives, and ladders. The assault would not be quick nor clean. It would be fought bunker by bunker, chamber by chamber, in a storm of steel and fire. The fate of Sevastopol's northern line rested on these battles. Fort Stalin, positioned on commanding ground, became the first fortress to feel the full brunt of German assault. For days, Stukas swooped overhead, bombs exploding in geysers of smoke and stone, collapsing trenches and blasting open entrances. German artillery zeroed in with precision, shells slamming into armored turrets until the earth itself trembled. Romanian infantry advanced across open ground, pushing through barbed wire and minefields under a curtain of fire. Soviet defenders, though half buried in rubble, emerged to meet them with rifles, grenades, and machine guns. Fighting raged in ruined bunkers, with flamethrowers clearing chambers, only to be met by counterattacks through hidden tunnels. Casualties piled high, the ground littered with bodies in uniforms of grey, green, and black. By nightfall, the fortress was encircled, its garrison cut off, but still resisting with savage determination. German pioneers detonated explosives against steel doors, blasting open pathways into the underground labyrinth. The siege of Fort Stalin became a miniature war within the larger battle, a clash fought in darkness and fire. After days of combat, the fortress finally fell, its last defenders either dead or captured, their weapons silent at last. Fort Lenin, nearby and equally formidable, became the next target for the 11th Army. Here the Germans applied lessons learned from Fort Stalin, coordinating artillery barrages with simultaneous infantry advances. The bombardment turned the surrounding landscape into a wasteland, hills flattened and ravines filled with dust and wreckage. German assault groups stormed forward in carefully rehearsed waves, supported by Romanian battalions holding the flanks. Soviet resistance was fanatical, gunners continuing to fire even as their positions collapsed around them. Bunker entrances were transformed into furnaces as flamethrowers belched streams of fire into confined chambers. Inside, defenders fought to the last breath, some detonating grenades to avoid capture. Prisoners were rare, for most fought until death rather than surrender their posts. After days of grinding combat, Fort Lenin too was reduced to silence, its guns shattered, its garrison extinguished. The fall of the fort marked another step in the gradual erosion of Sevastopol's northern wall. Yet even as it fell, the greatest fortress of all still stood, Maxim Gorky, the heart of the defences. Fort Maxim Gorky was unlike any other position, a fortress carved directly into the granite cliffs, and armed with naval-caliber guns. Its twin 305mm turrets, salvaged from pre-revolutionary battleships, had battered German positions relentlessly for months. Manstein understood that silencing Maxim Gorky was essential, for its guns dominated approaches to the city and the harbour beyond. Dora, the railway gun, was tasked with this mission, its enormous shells aimed squarely at the fort. For days the monster thundered, each shot blasting craters that shook the peninsula like earthquakes. Carl mortars added their fury, their shells plunging directly into the cliff face. Stukas dove in screaming waves, unloading bombs that sent rock and smoke billowing skyward. Inside the fortress, the garrison endured in darkness, walls cracking, ceilings collapsing, yet guns still roaring defiantly. German infantry closed in, pioneers placing charges against armoured doors and hatches. The battle for Maxim Gorky would become one of the most brutal episodes of the entire siege. The garrison of Maxim Gorky fought with a determination that bordered on the superhuman. Soviet gunners manned their turrets even as shells from Dora ripped into the mountain above them. Ammunition was hauled through shattered tunnels by exhausted men and women, each shell carried at risk of death from collapsing walls. Medical teams operated in choking dust and smoke, treating wounds by lantern light while the ground shook with every impact. Communication lines were severed repeatedly, forcing messengers to run through tunnels under fire to relay orders. Each chamber of the fortress became a battlefield where grenades and flamethrowers met bayonets and submachine guns. German troops advancing into the labyrinth described scenes of horror, with bodies piled in narrow corridors and fire consuming entire rooms. The defenders, knowing they could not hold forever, resolved to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Even as sections of the fortress fell, isolated groups continued to resist, emerging from hidden tunnels to launch counterattacks. The struggle lasted for days, a duel of willpower between men trapped in rock and those determined to root them out. When Maxim Gorky finally fell, it was not surrendered, it was buried in fire and ruin. The fall of these northern fortresses came at immense cost to both sides. German and Romanian units suffered thousands of casualties in the assaults, their progress measured in meters gained at the price of lives. Soviet defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, were annihilated almost to the last man, their sacrifice buying time for the fortress as a whole. The ground around the forts became unrecognizable, a landscape of shattered concrete, twisted steel, and unburied dead. Survivors described the stench of decay mingling with smoke, the cries of wounded echoing from collapsed chambers. German soldiers emerged from the ruins exhausted and grim, their victory paid for in blood and exhaustion. Soviet survivors were dragged from tunnels, dazed and blackened with soot, their uniforms torn to rags. Many were executed on the spot, branded as fanatics who had resisted too long. Others were marched into captivity, silent and hollow-eyed, their faces masks of defiance. The fall of the northern defences marked a turning point in the siege. The once impenetrable shield of Sevastopol was broken open. With the northern sector collapsing, Sevastopol itself became increasingly vulnerable to further Axis advances. The loss of Fort Stalin, Fort Lenin, and Maxim Gorky deprived the fortress of its strongest artillery positions. German units could now move closer to the city, their guns firing with greater accuracy against inner defences. Soviet commanders shifted troops southward, reinforcing Sapun Ridge and the approaches to the harbour. Ammunition shortages grew more severe as the fall of northern depots severed key supply lines. The morale of defenders wavered, shaken by the loss of positions once deemed unassailable. Civilians whispered of the end, though propaganda insisted the fortress would never fall. The NKVD tightened control, arresting anyone suspected of spreading defeatism or despair. For the first time, the defenders faced the grim reality that the enemy was breaking through. The fall of the northern defences signalled not just a tactical loss, but a psychological blow. Sevastopol was wounded, and the enemy was closing in. For Manstein, the capture of the northern defences was a critical victory, proof that his methodical siege tactics were working. He reported to Berlin with pride, emphasizing the destruction of Maxim Gorky as a triumph of German engineering and determination. Hitler, pleased with the news, pressed for the final destruction of the fortress without delay. The soldiers of the 11th Army, though exhausted, drew confidence from their success, convinced the end was near. Yet they also understood that the fighting ahead would be no less brutal, for Sevastopol still bristled with guns and defenders. The northern wall had fallen, but the fortress city remained defiant behind its next layers of defense. Soviet commanders vowed to fight on, shifting their strength to Sapun Ridge and the southern approaches. The siege was entering its final, most destructive phase. The fall of the northern defences was not the end but the beginning of the last act. Sevastopol's fate now hung by a thread, stretched to breaking under fire and steel. By late June 1942, the fate of Sevastopol narrowed to a single battlefield, Sapun Ridge. This long, elevated spine of ground dominated the approaches to the city, its slopes bristling with bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions. For months, Soviet engineers had transformed the ridge into a fortress of earth and steel, a wall that shielded the heart of the city from Axis assault. Manstein understood that breaking Sapun Ridge was the key to collapsing the entire defensive system. He concentrated divisions, artillery, and air support for an attack designed to smash through in one overwhelming blow. The ridge, though scarred by weeks of bombardment, still stood defiantly against German guns and Stuka raids. Soviet defenders, veterans of countless assaults, prepared to fight to the death in positions dug deep into rock. They knew that if Sapun fell, the fortress would lose its shield, and Sevastopol itself would be exposed. For both attacker and defender, this battle was more than tactical. It was the climax of the siege. The ridge had become the pivot on which the destiny of the fortress would turn. The German attack began on June 28th, preceded by a thunderous artillery barrage that seemed to last without end. Hundreds of guns fired in rolling waves, shells crashing into bunkers and trenches in a storm of fire. Stukas descended in screaming dives, dropping bombs that tore craters across the slopes and sent showers of debris into the sky. The Karl mortars fired again, their monstrous shells collapsing galleries and crushing defenders beneath tons of rock. Smoke and dust blanketed the ridge, turning daylight into a choking twilight of confusion and terror. German infantry surged forward behind the barrage, engineers clearing mines and obstacles with explosives. Soviet defenders, half buried in rubble, emerged from shelters to man machine guns and fire mortars with grim determination. Casualties mounted instantly on both sides, the slopes littered with bodies within hours of the assault. Despite the bombardment, many Soviet strongpoints survived, pouring fire into advancing German ranks. The attack on Sapun Ridge had begun, and it was already one of the bloodiest struggles of the entire siege. The terrain itself made the fighting a nightmare for attackers. Sapun Ridge rose steeply, its slopes broken by ravines and gullies that funneled advancing troops into kill zones. Soviet machine guns, positioned to cover these natural choke points, cut down attackers with merciless precision. German officers urged their men forward, but progress was measured in meters gained at enormous cost. Assault groups carrying flamethrowers and satchel charges advanced through smoke, only to be ambushed by defenders hidden in caves. Mortar fire rained from concealed pits, showering the slopes with deadly fragments. Every rise, every trench line became a fortress in its own right, defended by soldiers determined to hold to the last. Romanian battalions on the flanks suffered heavily, pinned down by overlapping fields of Soviet fire. Stukas returned again and again, blasting gun nests, but new ones always seemed to reappear. For the attackers, the ridge seemed endless, each position conquered, revealing yet another line of resistance. The mountain itself felt alive, swallowing men into its defenses. Inside the Soviet positions, the defenders endured conditions scarcely imaginable. Tunnels shook with every shell, dust choking lungs, and blinding eyes as men loaded rifles and grenades. Ammunition was carried by hand through collapsing passages, every trip a gamble with death. Machine gunners fired until barrels glowed red, rotating weapons with practiced desperation. Medics worked in corners of bunkers, treating wounds with dwindling supplies and listening to the ceiling groan under bombardment. Civilians trapped on the ridge served as runners, carrying messages and water through fields raked with fire. Officers shouted orders above the roar, urging their men to hold positions already surrounded on three sides. Defenders spoke of fighting not only for Sevastopol, but for the honor of the Soviet Union itself. Some carved last letters into scraps of wood or stone, knowing they would not leave alive. Against the storm of German steel, the ridge's defenders became legends, their courage etched into every crumbling wall. As the battle raged, German units employed a relentless rhythm of assault and bombardment. Artillery smashed a sector, infantry stormed forward, pioneers blasted bunkers, and airstrikes pounded survivors into silence. This process repeated endlessly, grinding down resistance in brutal cycles of destruction. German flamethrowers turned trenches into infernos, while grenades rolled through bunker doors in cascades of fire and shrapnel. Hand-to-hand combat was frequent, fought in smoke-filled chambers with knives, bayonets, and fists. Soviet counterattacks erupted from hidden tunnels, surprising attackers who believed positions had been cleared. The fighting became so intimate that soldiers described hearing the breath of their enemies before striking. By night, flares lit the sky in eerie glow, casting shadows of men locked in endless struggle. The slopes of Sapun became a battlefield without silence, where rest was impossible and survival uncertain. The ridge was being consumed in a furnace of fire and blood. For the Romanians, fighting alongside the Germans, Sapun Ridge was a trial of endurance unlike anything they had faced. Tasked with holding flanks and supporting attacks, they advanced through withering Soviet fire with courage that cost them dearly. Entire companies were obliterated by concentrated machine gun bursts or trapped under collapsing bunkers. Romanian officers rallied their men with cries of honor and duty, even as their numbers dwindled with each hour. Many paid with their lives for positions that would later be taken again by German reinforcements. Yet their presence was vital, stretching Soviet defenses thinner and allowing German divisions to focus on breakthrough sectors. Their sacrifice was recognized even by German officers who had once doubted their reliability. Romanian graves dotted the ridge, silent testimony to the shared cost of the assault. In the end, their blood was woven into the victory as surely as that of the Wehrmacht. Sapun Ridge became their crucible, their suffering etched into the history of the siege. By June 29th, the Soviet line on Sapun Ridge began to collapse under the sheer weight of German firepower. Bunkers that had survived weeks of shelling finally fell silent, their garrisons either dead or buried alive. Counterattacks grew weaker, their numbers too few to stem the tide of advancing divisions. German flags appeared on high ground, signaling that the ridge's backbone was breaking at last. Soviet commanders ordered desperate last stands, sending reserves into the inferno despite knowing they could not prevail. Naval infantry fought with characteristic ferocity, charging with bayonets into machine gun fire to buy precious minutes. The ridge, once a shield for Sevastopol, now became a graveyard for its defenders. By nightfall, German and Romanian troops controlled much of the ridge, though scattered resistance continued in pockets of defiance. The fall of Sapun Ridge marked the cracking of Sevastopol's heart. The fortress had lost its central pillar, and the end was rushing closer. For Manstein, the capture of Sapun Ridge was the decisive breakthrough he had sought. He reported the victory to Berlin with satisfaction, emphasizing that Sevastopol was now within his grasp. German soldiers, though exhausted, felt pride in having conquered what seemed an impregnable wall of stone and steel. For the Soviets, the loss was catastrophic, stripping away the last major barrier shielding the city itself. Civilians inside Sevastopol realized the fortress was doomed, though propaganda still promised victory and salvation. The NKVD tightened its grip, but whispers of evacuation and defeat spread through the shelters. For the defenders, the fall of Sapun Ridge meant only one choice remained: fight to the end or perish in captivity. The ridge, scarred and blood-soaked, stood as a monument to courage and destruction alike. The siege had entered its final act, and the shadow of collapse hung heavy over the city. Sevastopol's fortress walls were cracking, and the storm was breaking through. As the walls of Sevastopol crumbled in June 1942, the Black Sea Fleet found itself drawn into a desperate struggle for survival. For months its ships had carried reinforcements, food and ammunition into the fortress, defying Luftwaffe bombers and U-boat patrols. Now with Sapun Ridge fallen, and Axis troops pressing toward the city, the fleet's mission shifted from supply to salvation. Evacuation became a grim necessity, a race to save as many soldiers and civilians as possible before the fortress collapsed. Destroyers, submarines and transports slipped into the harbor by night, their decks packed with the wounded and exhausted. Every voyage was a gamble, for German bombers prowled the skies by day, and submarines stalked the waters by night. Sailors worked frantically to load men, ammunition and supplies in darkness, always listening for the whistle of bombs. The once proud fleet, centerpiece of Soviet power in the south, had become a lifeline stretched to breaking. Each successful run was a miracle, each sinking a catastrophe. The Black Sea itself became a battlefield where the survival of Sevastopol was wagered on every wave. The Luftwaffe, led by Richthofen's the 8th Air Corps, understood that the fleet was the fortress's last hope. Stuka dive bombers circled over the Black Sea like predators, waiting for ships to emerge from the protective embrace of Sevastopol's harbor. Convoys were attacked with merciless precision, bombs plunging into decks and igniting cargo holds in firestorms. Soviet destroyers, armed with anti-aircraft guns, fought back desperately, filling the sky with flak. But the Germans always returned, wave after wave, until ships burned or disappeared beneath the sea. The cruiser Krasny Kavkaz was heavily damaged, limping back to port with decks awash in blood and twisted metal. Smaller transports, less protected, fared even worse, many going down with hundreds of men aboard. Survivors clung to wreckage, their cries echoing across the waves until silence claimed them. German pilots took pride in hunting the Soviet fleet, seeing each sinking as a step toward final victory. For the sailors of the Black Sea, every sortie became an ordeal of courage against impossible odds. The sea, once their domain, now belonged to the enemy above. Inside Sevastopol's harbor, scenes of chaos unfolded as the fleet attempted its final missions. Quays were choked with wounded soldiers, civilians, and crates of ammunition waiting to be loaded. Families clutched children in the hope of evacuation, while officers tried to maintain order with shouted commands. Sailors carried stretchers onto decks, already crowded with men too weak to stand. Anti-aircraft batteries fired constantly, their tracers lighting the night as bombers attacked even the harbor itself. Fires spread across warehouses and ships, the water glowing with burning fuel that clung to men who fell into the sea. Captains faced impossible choices, deciding which units could be saved and which would be left behind to fight to the end. Ships overloaded beyond capacity risked capsizing, yet no space was left unused. For many, the voyage out of Sevastopol was not salvation but a death sentence, as German bombers struck before they cleared the coast. The harbour, once a proud symbol of Soviet naval strength, had become a place of desperation and farewell. Every departure felt like the last. One of the most tragic episodes came with the sinking of the transport Abkhazia. Packed with wounded soldiers, medical staff, and civilians, the ship slipped out of Sevastopol under the cover of darkness. At dawn, it was spotted by German reconnaissance aircraft and attacked by Stukas within hours. Bombs struck the deck, detonating fuel stores and engulfing the vessel in a raging inferno. Men leapt into the sea, their bodies quickly consumed by fire or dragged under by the suction of the sinking hull. Escorting destroyers fought valiantly, driving off attackers, but the damage was already done. Hundreds perished in the flames, their final cries carried by the wind across the waves. Survivors clung to rafts and debris, plucked from the sea by Soviet submarines, risking exposure to rescue them. The loss of the Abkhazia was a devastating blow, both in lives and morale, a symbol of the dangers that haunted every mission. For those who witnessed it, the sight of the burning ship etched itself into memory as the embodiment of the fleet's agony. Despite the carnage, the Black Sea Fleet continued to fight. Its sailors driven by duty and desperation, submarines slipped through minefields and patrol lines, carrying supplies into the city and evacuating men on their return. Destroyers like Tashkent, nicknamed the Blue Cruiser, became legends for their speed and resilience, braving constant air attack to deliver reinforcements. The Tashkent alone evacuated thousands of soldiers before being mortally wounded by German bombers in July. Each voyage became a story of defiance, ships running gauntlets of fire to keep the fortress alive. Crews lived with the knowledge that every mission could be their last, yet volunteered again and again. Soviet propaganda hailed them as heroes, their exploits broadcast to inspire defenders clinging to hope. In truth, each success was offset by staggering losses, as more ships joined the growing graveyard beneath the Black Sea. Still, the fleet refused to abandon its city, its men fighting not only for survival, but for the honor of their flag. In these final days, the Black Sea Fleet stood as Sevastopol's last guardian. German air superiority ensured that each naval mission was a battle in itself. Convoys leaving the Caucasus coast often came under attack before they even reached Crimea. Escorts maneuvered frantically, zigzagging through bomb blasts and plumes of seawater thrown up by near misses. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their barrels warped, their faces blackened by smoke and sweat. Pilots of the Luftwaffe described the sea as a shooting gallery where Soviet ships had nowhere to hide. Soviet sailors saw it differently, a gauntlet of sacrifice, where every voyage brought another day for the defenders of Sevastopol. Communication was difficult, with radio silence enforced to avoid detection, leaving ships vulnerable to sudden ambush. Navigating by stars and dead reckoning, captains pushed their vessels to the limit of endurance. Many ships never returned, their loss reported only when days passed with no word. Each sinking drained the fortress of strength, each survival breathed life into its resistance. The air war over the sea was as decisive as the battles fought on land. Inside Sevastopol, the fall of Sapun Ridge and the destruction of the fleet's lifelines filled shelters with despair. Soldiers whispered of evacuation, though many knew they would be left behind to cover the retreat. Civilians begged for places on departing ships, but capacity was too limited to save them all. Commanders faced impossible decisions, balancing the survival of units with the defense of the fortress. For Admiral Brusky, the fleet's commander, each order carried the weight of lives, measured against strategic necessity. He authorized evacuations of key personnel and specialists, ensuring they could continue the fight elsewhere. Ordinary soldiers, however, were told to hold the line, even as supplies dwindled and reinforcements ceased. The fleet could no longer deliver salvation, it could only buy time. Those left behind understood the truth, but still fought with the same ferocity, as if relief was on its way. The fortress and its fleet were dying together, entwined in sacrifice and tragedy. By July 1942, the Black Sea Fleet's last stand had come to an end. The once mighty force was shattered, its proud cruisers and destroyers sunk or crippled, its transports lost to fire and steel. Survivors limped back to Caucasus ports, carrying the wounded and broken remnants of Sevastopol's defenders. For the fortress, the loss of naval support was a death sentence, sealing its isolation under Axis fire. German soldiers advancing into the ruins found abandoned docks and burning ships, silent testimony to the fleet's struggle. Sailors who remained fought as infantry, their black uniforms blending with the naval brigades that had defended the city since the beginning. The Black Sea itself, littered with wrecks, became a graveyard for thousands who had sought salvation in its waves. Yet, in their sacrifice, the sailors of the fleet had upheld their vow to defend Sevastopol to the last. Their ships were gone, their strength exhausted, but their defiance endured in memory. The Black Sea Fleet's last stand was not only a military episode, it was a requiem of courage played against the roar of bombs and the silence of the deep. By the first days of July 1942, the fortress of Sevastopol had reached the breaking point. Weeks of relentless bombardment had torn its defenses apart, reducing fortresses to rubble and burying entire garrisons beneath collapsed concrete. Sapun Ridge had fallen. The Black Sea Fleet lay shattered, and supply convoys no longer reached the city's harbour. The northern and eastern fortifications, once bastions of defiance, were now smoking ruins dotted with German banners. Soviet soldiers who had endured since the first assaults were exhausted, their ranks thinned by casualties and starvation. Ammunition was scarce, with gunners often holding fire until enemy troops were within meters of their positions. Food rations had dwindled to near nothing, leaving defenders too weak to man their weapons for long. Civilians trapped in caves and tunnels clung to survival in darkness, filled with hunger and fear. The fortress still bristled with defiance, but its strength was crumbling under the weight of attrition. The collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. German and Romanian troops pressed forward with renewed ferocity, sensing that victory was within their grasp. Manstein ordered coordinated assaults across multiple sectors, overwhelming the last Soviet strongpoints with concentrated firepower. Artillery continued its ceaseless pounding, shells raining onto bunkers already scarred by weeks of bombardment. Infantry advanced in waves, engineers following close behind with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Soviet defenses cracked under the pressure, trenches overrun and bunkers captured after brutal close-quarters fighting. Resistance remained fierce in pockets, but each stand ended in annihilation as Axis forces pressed deeper into the city. Romanians, who had suffered heavily throughout the siege, fought with renewed determination, capturing positions once thought beyond their reach. The battlefield was a wasteland of craters, smoke, and broken bodies, where the living fought among the ruins of the dead. Each day saw Soviet lines contract further, their commanders struggling to maintain cohesion in a crumbling front. The once mighty fortress was shrinking into a battlefield of desperation. Inside the city, Soviet commanders, Ivan Petrov and Philip Oktyabrsky, faced impossible choices. Communications broke down as telephone lines were destroyed and runners failed to return. Orders to hold sectors often arrived too late, their recipients already overrun by German assaults. Reinforcements could no longer be spared, for every available man was already at the front or manning the barricades. Naval infantry, once the pride of the garrison, had been reduced to remnants fighting with bayonets and pistols. Anti-aircraft guns, out of shells, turned to direct fire against advancing infantry, their crews determined to fight until the last round. Underground command posts shook under constant bombardment, maps torn and covered in ash as officers tried to piece together the chaos. Stalin's demand that Sevastopol be held at all costs hung heavy over every decision, even as the situation became untenable. The commanders knew surrender was forbidden, yet the fortress was disintegrating before their eyes. The collapse of the lines was not only physical, it was command dissolving into desperation. The defense had reached its final stage. The last Soviet strongpoints became islands of resistance in a sea of advancing Axis troops. Forts reduced to rubble still echoed with gunfire, defenders firing from shattered embrasures until flamethrowers silenced them. Tunnels collapsed, burying men alive, while survivors emerged from side passages to continue the fight. Machine gun nests, camouflaged beneath debris, cut down attackers before being blasted apart by grenades and artillery. Each bunker became a final stand, defenders often fighting to the death rather than surrender. German and Romanian soldiers described the combat as nightmarish, with resistance springing from ruins thought already conquered. Entire Soviet units disappeared in the rubble, their last moments recorded only in the silence that followed. The NKVD ensured that retreat was unthinkable, shooting deserters and urging others to fight to the last bullet. Yet even their threats became redundant, for most soldiers fought simply because there was no other choice. The collapse of the lines was measured not in withdrawals but in annihilation. For civilians, the final days of the siege brought unimaginable suffering. Shelters overflowed with the wounded, their cries echoing in tunnels darkened by smoke and dust. Water became nearly impossible to find, forcing families to risk sniper fire at shattered wells. Starvation hollowed faces, children reduced to skin and bone as rations disappeared. Bombs collapsed entire caves, burying families alive in tombs of stone and earth. Civilians wandered the ruins in shock, carrying bundles of possessions that meant nothing in the face of death. Some joined the defenders, carrying ammunition or serving as medics in makeshift hospitals. Others waited in silence, resigned to the fate that approached with each German advance. Propaganda still blared defiance through loudspeakers, but few had the strength to believe it anymore. The people of Sevastopol had endured for months, but now they faced the same collapse as the soldiers on the front lines. Their fortress was dying around them, and with it their hope. German troops, though advancing, paid heavily for every step into the city. Snipers haunted ruined buildings, their shots echoing like whispers of defiance. Soviet artillery, though dwindling, still unleashed sudden barrages that shattered formations and delayed progress. Mines and booby traps claimed lives in every street, forcing engineers to clear paths under fire. Flamethrowers illuminated cellars and tunnels, filling them with choking smoke and screams. German soldiers described the fighting as worse than anything at Moscow or Kiev, a war fought not only against men, but against stone itself. Romanians advancing through secondary sectors took pride in their progress, but endured staggering casualties. Each captured bunker required fresh sacrifices, each street wrested from Soviet hands paid for with blood. Exhaustion weighed heavily on attackers and defenders alike, but only one side still held reserves. For the Axis, victory was inevitable. for the Soviet survival was no longer possible. The battle had become a grim reckoning. By July 3rd, the last organized Soviet defenses collapsed in the southern sector of the city. German divisions raised their banners over captured strongholds, signaling that the fortress was no longer defensible. Soviet units fought in isolated pockets, cut off from command and surrounded on all sides. Some tried to break out toward the sea, only to be cut down by German fire or drowned in desperate attempts to swim. Others surrendered in groups, their weapons cast aside as they staggered forward in exhaustion and defeat. The great coastal batteries, once thunderous guardians of the Black Sea, were silent, their guns destroyed or captured. Sevastopol's fate had been sealed, the fortress reduced to rubble and blood. Manstein declared victory, reporting to Berlin that the strongest fortress on the Eastern Front had been conquered. For the defenders there was no triumph, only the bitter truth of collapse. The battle for Sevastopol was ending in fire and silence. The fall of the Soviet lines marked the end of an epic siege that had lasted nearly 8 months. The fortress, once a symbol of Soviet defiance, was reduced to ruins under the combined weight of artillery, air power, and infantry assault. Over 90,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, while tens of thousands more lay dead beneath the rubble. German and Romanian troops, though victorious, emerged exhausted, their ranks thinned by the fury of the defense. Manstein's triumph was celebrated in Berlin as proof of German military supremacy, a conquest hailed across the Reich. For the Soviets, the loss was catastrophic, both militarily and symbolically, a wound that echoed across the Eastern Front. Yet even in defeat, the defense of Sevastopol became legend, remembered as a testament to resilience against impossible odds. The collapse of the lines was not the end of the story, but the beginning of its memory. The fortress had fallen, but its spirit endured in the sacrifices of those who held it to the last. Sevastopol, though conquered, was never truly broken. On July 4, 1942, the red banners that had flown defiantly above Sevastopol were lowered under the relentless weight of Axis fire. For 8 long months the city had stood against every weapon of the German arsenal, but now its defences lay in ruins. Smoke blanketed the harbour, black plumes rising from burning ships and warehouses that once fed the fortress. German artillery fell silent only when there was nothing left to destroy, the guns having broken the back of the once proud defences. Soviet commanders, their communications severed and their armies shattered, gave the order to withdraw into the caves and catacombs. Underground, thousands of survivors gathered in desperation, hoping to hold out a few days longer in the darkness. German troops entered the ruins cautiously, bayonets fixed, wary of ambushes that might spring from tunnels and rubble. The last act of the siege had begun, not in open battle, but in the shadows of a dead city. Sevastopol, the invincible fortress, was falling. Its final breath came not with thunder, but with silence. German and Romanian soldiers raised their flags over the shattered remnants of forts, once considered impregnable. Sapun Ridge, Maxim Gorky, Stalin and Lenin, all now lay buried beneath dust and blood. Streets once defended by naval infantry became graveyards of black uniformed corpses, their last stands immortalized in scorched ruins. Romanians marched prisoners toward makeshift camps, their columns stretching for kilometers through the rubble. German units pushed into the harbor, finding Soviet ships half sunk at their moorings, decks littered with the dead who never escaped. The great coastal batteries were silent, their turrets twisted and broken, their garrisons annihilated or entombed. Soldiers described the city as a landscape of ghosts, where buildings stood like skeletal remains, and silence carried the weight of tragedy. Even hardened veterans of the Eastern Front admitted they had never seen such devastation. The red banner no longer flew, but its shadow lingered across the ruins like a memory. For the Axis, the conquest was a triumph. For the Soviets, it was a tragedy written in stone and ash. Thousands of Soviet soldiers, cut off from command, retreated into caves and tunnels beneath the city. These underground warrens became their last redoubts, where small units clung to the hope of continued resistance. With little food, no water, and dwindling ammunition, they prepared to fight on in darkness. Germans attempted to flush them out with grenades, flamethrowers, and explosives, turning tunnels into tombs of fire and smoke. Still, pockets of defiance persisted, emerging to fire at patrols or launch sudden ambushes before vanishing underground. The caves echoed with coughs of the wounded, cries of hunger, and the prayers of men who knew the end was near. Some defenders carved farewell messages on stone walls, leaving behind words for a nation they would never see again. Others refused capture, detonating grenades to die with dignity rather than surrender. For the Axis, rooting out these last holdouts became a slow, grisly task. For the Soviets, it was a final gesture of defiance against the inevitable. The scale of surrender was staggering, as tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians emerged from hiding, exhausted, starved, and broken. They staggered into the open with hands raised, their uniforms tattered and faces hollow. German and Romanian guards herded them into columns, marching them away from the city under the hot July sun. Some carried makeshift flags of truce, improvised from cloth or torn banners soaked in dirt and blood. Civilians wept openly as families were torn apart, men taken as prisoners while women and children were left behind. The prisoners included high-ranking officers, engineers and political commissars, their capture a propaganda victory for Berlin. German photographers captured the scenes, their images circulated as proof of Hitler's triumph in the south. Yet behind the spectacle of surrender lay untold suffering, as prisoners collapsed along the roads from exhaustion and thirst. For the Soviets, captivity often meant death, whether through starvation, disease, or execution. The fall of Sevastopol ended in silence, broken only by the shuffle of countless feet marching into captivity. Among those captured were the remnants of the naval infantry brigades, men who had fought since the first days of the siege. Their black uniforms, once a symbol of terror to German troops, were now ragged and caked in grime. They marched barefoot, rifles discarded, their bodies reduced to shadows of the warriors they once were. Yet their bearing still carried pride, heads held high despite the chains of defeat. German soldiers who had once feared them looked with grudging respect, acknowledging their ferocity in battle. Many of these men would never see home again, perishing in prisoner of war camps, where conditions were brutal and unforgiving. Others vanished into the endless machinery of war, their names forgotten except in Soviet records. The naval brigades had been Sevastopol's soul, and their capture marked the true end of the fortress. They had given everything, and still, it had not been enough. Their march into captivity was the final chapter of their defiance. The human cost of Sevastopol's fall was immense, dwarfing the triumph celebrated in Berlin. Over 90,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, joining the thousands who had already fallen in battle. Civilians, numbering in the tens of thousands, faced deportation, forced labor, or summary execution under German occupation. The city itself was unrecognizable, its streets reduced to rubble, its harbor a graveyard of twisted steel and sunken ships. The underground hospitals were filled with corpses, doctors and nurses, unable to save themselves as walls collapsed around them. Children wandered through ruins, their eyes vacant, their families gone, their futures uncertain. For those who survived, life under occupation promised only hardship and fear. Yet even amid the ruin, stories of survival persisted, civilians hiding in caves, children carried out of the rubble, sailors rescued from sinking ships. The fall of Sevastopol was not merely a military defeat, it was a human catastrophe. Its echoes would haunt Crimea for generations. For Manstein, the victory was both personal and professional triumph. He reported to Berlin that the strongest fortress on the Eastern Front had fallen to his command. Hitler congratulated him, awarding him the rank of Field Marshal for his achievement. Propaganda trumpeted the fall as proof of German invincibility, claiming that no fortress could withstand the Reich's might. German newspapers carried photographs of prisoners and ruins, celebrating the triumph as a symbol of destiny fulfilled. Yet behind the reports lay the truth of staggering casualties, for the 11th Army had been bled white in the process. German soldiers, though victorious, carried scars that would not fade, their memories of Sevastopol forever marked by the ferocity of the defense. For Romanians, the victory brought pride but also grief, their losses heavy and their sacrifices immense. Sevastopol had been won, but at a price that weighed heavily on its conquerors. Even in triumph, the shadow of the siege lingered. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Sevastopol was a tragedy, but not the end of the story. Moscow mourned the loss, but hailed the defenders as heroes, their sacrifice immortalized as an example of Soviet courage. The city was declared a hero city after the war, its ruins preserved as a testament to endurance against impossible odds. Survivors spoke of months of darkness, hunger, and unyielding defiance, their memories shaping Soviet identity for decades. The fall became legend, a tale told not as defeat but as resistance that had cost the enemy dearly. Even as prisoners marched into camps and ruins smoldered, the spirit of Sevastopol remained unbroken in memory. For the Axis, it was a conquest. For the Soviets, it was a martyrdom. The siege had ended, but its echoes carried across the Eastern Front, shaping battles yet to come. Sevastopol's red banner was gone, but its story had only begun. In ruin, it had become immortal. The fall of Sevastopol in July 1942 left behind a landscape of devastation so vast it defied comprehension. Entire districts of the city had been reduced to rubble, their outlines erased by months of bombardment and fire. Craters scarred the streets, collapsed buildings stood like jagged tombstones, and the harbor was littered with the hulks of sunken ships. German soldiers advancing through the ruins described silence broken only by the cries of the wounded and the stench of death. The once proud naval base of the Soviet Union had been transformed into a wasteland, a place where survival itself seemed miraculous. Civilians emerged cautiously from caves and cellars, their faces gaunt, their bodies weak from hunger and thirst. Many wandered aimlessly among the ruins, searching for lost relatives or scraps of food. For the victors, the destruction was a testament to the cost of conquest. For the survivors, it was the measure of their suffering. Sevastopol was no longer a fortress, it was a graveyard, and in that graveyard, the human cost of war was written in every stone. The toll in human lives was staggering, far beyond the numbers officially reported. Over 90,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the final days, joining tens of thousands already lost during the siege. German estimates placed Soviet military dead at more than 100,000, though many lay buried beneath collapsed fortifications and rubble. Civilian deaths were harder to count, as families were wiped out in bombings or starved in hidden shelters. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, their populations swallowed by the relentless storm of artillery and air raids. German and Romanian forces too paid heavily, losing over 35,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The 11th Army had won its greatest victory, but had been bled so deeply that it could never recover its strength. Graves dotted the hillsides, marked with crude wooden crosses, or left unmarked in mass pits. Survivors recalled the smell of decay lingering for weeks, carried by winds across the ruins and valleys. Sevastopol was a victory measured not in glory, but in corpses. For civilians, survival did not end with the battle. It only entered a new stage of suffering. German occupation brought harsh reprisals, mass arrests, and immediate deportations of those suspected of aiding the defense. Families were torn apart as men were marched into captivity, while women and children were left to fend for themselves. Thousands were sent to forced labor camps in Germany or the occupied territories, their lives consumed in service to the Reich. Others faced execution, accused of being partisans, spies, or sympathizers of the Soviet cause. The NKVD's presence during the siege had ensured that civilians were already worn by suspicion and fear. Under occupation, that fear only deepened. Starvation persisted as supplies remained scarce, and rationing under German rule was brutal and unequal. Children begged in the streets, trading trinkets for bread, their childhoods erased by war. The destruction of infrastructure left water and electricity non-existent, forcing survivors to scavenge daily for the means to live. For civilians, Sevastopol had not only been lost, it had been consumed. The harbour, once the heart of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, now stood as a monument to destruction. Sunken destroyers and transports jutted from the water at odd angles, their blackened hulls spilling oil across the surface. Cranes lay twisted on the docks, warehouses collapsed, and cranes frozen mid-lift as if struck by lightning. German engineers set to work clearing wreckage, but the scale of devastation was overwhelming. Mines and unexploded shells made every step dangerous, a hidden menace lurking beneath the rubble. Sailors' corpses floated among the wrecks, their uniforms torn, their bodies bloated in the summer heat. For Axis forces, the harbour offered both a prize and a challenge, a conquered naval base that would take months to make usable. For Soviets who remembered it alive with ships and banners, its ruins were unbearable to behold. The destruction of the fleet marked not only a military loss, but a symbolic one, the heart of Soviet pride torn out. Sevastopol's harbour had become a watery grave, its silence echoing louder than its guns ever had. The city itself was gutted, its infrastructure obliterated by the siege. Hospitals, schools, and theatres that once served the proud population lay in ashes. Roads were impassable, choked with debris, and entire blocks had collapsed into craters left by Dora's shells. Survivors described wandering through streets where landmarks had vanished, unable to recognize their own homes. Churches stood roofless, their bells silenced, their walls scarred by shrapnel. The famous defensive forts, once thought impregnable, were now twisted ruins, scattered with rusting gun barrels. Tunnels were filled with the dead, their entrances sealed by explosions or deliberate demolition. Even nature bore scars, with forests splintered into skeletal remains and hills reshaped by bombardment. The very earth seemed mutilated, reshaped by the violence inflicted upon it. Sevastopol was no longer a living city, it was a corpse. For the Axis, victory brought rewards but also bitter costs. Manstein was promoted to Field Marshal, celebrated as the conqueror of the Gibraltar of the East. Hitler praised the triumph, proclaiming it as proof of German destiny fulfilled. Yet the 11th Army, depleted by months of grueling combat, was no longer fit for major operations. Divisions that had stormed fortresses were shadows of their former strength, their ranks filled with exhausted survivors. Romanian units, praised for their contribution, mourned losses that crippled entire brigades. Equipment was worn down, artillery barrels warped from ceaseless firing, and ammunition reserves depleted by the storm of fire. The victory was complete, but it was Pyrrhic, a triumph that left the victors staggering. Manstein himself admitted privately that the cost had been almost beyond endurance. Sevastopol had fallen, but it had consumed much of the strength that conquered it. For the Soviet Union, the loss was catastrophic but not meaningless. The defenders of Sevastopol were hailed as martyrs, their resistance compared to the ancient heroes of Russian history. Stalin's propaganda machine turned tragedy into inspiration, declaring that every drop of blood spilled had bought time for the wider front. Newspapers spoke of courage and endurance, omitting the scale of casualties but emphasizing the spirit of defiance. Survivors who escaped captivity became symbols of resilience, their stories retold across the Soviet Union. Families of the fallen were told that their loved ones had died heroes, defending the motherland against impossible odds. Sevastopol itself would later be named a hero city, immortalized in monuments and memory. The ruins became sacred, a reminder that defeat did not mean surrender. For the Soviets, the human cost was unbearable, but the legend it created was invaluable. Sevastopol's destruction became part of the mythos of victory yet to come. The aftermath of Sevastopol revealed the true nature of modern war, victory measured in ruins and survival paid for with blood. The fortress had fallen, but in its fall it consumed armies, shattered families, and scarred landscapes beyond recognition. Civilians lived with trauma that would never fade, their memories carved as deeply as the craters that pocked the earth. German and Romanian soldiers carried home stories of fighting that defied imagination, their triumph shadowed by exhaustion and loss. Soviet prisoners marched into captivity, their fate uncertain, their sacrifice certain. For Manstein, the victory secured his place in military history, but it also drained his army beyond repair. For the Soviets, the fall of Sevastopol was not an ending, but a chapter in a larger saga of endurance. The cost was unbearable, the suffering unimaginable, yet the memory became immortal. The city lay in ashes, but its story burned brightly in the hearts of those who survived. In Sevastopol's ruin, the human cost of war was revealed in its fullest, most tragic form. The fall of Sevastopol in July 1942 did not merely mark the end of a siege. It reshaped the entire strategic balance of the Eastern Front. With the fortress silenced, the German 11th Army, under Erich von Manstein, was finally free from its exhausting commitment in Crimea. For 8 months, over 200,000 Axis soldiers, thousands of artillery pieces, and nearly the entire Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps had been tied down in the struggle. Now these battle-hardened formations could be redeployed to reinforce Hitler's grand summer offensive, Operation Blue. This operation aimed at nothing less than the seizure of the Caucasus oil fields and the capture of Stalingrad, the city that bore Stalin's name. Sevastopol's conquest thus opened the door for a fresh wave of German ambition, redirecting exhausted divisions into new battles. The victory was celebrated in Berlin as a sign that nothing could stand in the path of the Wehrmacht. Yet the truth was more complex, for the price of that victory carried consequences of its own. The strategic impact of Sevastopol was both liberation and burden. The 11th Army itself, though triumphant, was drained by the ordeal. Its divisions had suffered tens of thousands of casualties in the brutal street fighting, bunker assaults, and ceaseless artillery duels. Equipment was worn out, artillery barrels warped from constant fire, and supply lines stretched thin across the vast distances of Crimea. While reinforcements were promised, the units that left Sevastopol were shadows of their former strength. Manstein was promoted to Field Marshal, his reputation as one of Germany's greatest commanders cemented by the victory. Yet his exhausted formations were soon transferred to other fronts, some sent to Leningrad, others earmarked for Stalingrad. Soldiers who had endured months of subterranean battles now found themselves once again marching into fresh hells. The fortress had been conquered, but it had consumed the very energy needed for future campaigns. What Berlin hailed as triumph, many soldiers remembered as a hollow victory. The 11th Army's legacy would be measured not just in conquest, but in exhaustion. For the German High Command, Sevastopol's fall offered a rare moment of confidence. The so-called Gibraltar of the East, a fortress thought impregnable, had been reduced in less than a year. Hitler seized on this victory as proof of the superiority of German arms and the inevitability of his vision for the East. He boasted that if Sevastopol could fall, then Stalingrad and the Caucasus would surely follow. This confidence infused the planning of Operation Blue, encouraging risk-taking and overextension. The same Luftwaffe units that had crushed Sevastopol from the skies were soon redeployed to bomb the Volga city into rubble. Artillery regiments, once used to pound Maxim Gorky and Sapun Ridge, were reassigned to batter Soviet positions on new fronts. Sevastopol became a case study in how siege warfare could succeed with overwhelming firepower and persistence. But in transferring the methods of Crimea to Stalingrad, the Germans failed to see the difference in scale and circumstance. What had worked on the Black Sea's shores could not be so easily repeated on the Volga. For the Soviets, the fall of Sevastopol was a bitter wound, but also a sobering lesson. The loss of the city deprived the Red Army of a major fortress, a base for the Black Sea Fleet, and a symbol of defiance. Yet it also revealed the brutal effectiveness of German siege tactics, lessons that Soviet planners absorbed for the battles to come. At Stalingrad, they would employ deeper defenses, greater mobility, and far larger reserves to counter German firepower. Stalin, enraged by the loss, demanded vengeance and redoubled his determination to hold the Volga at any cost. Sevastopol's defenders, hailed as martyrs, provided a rallying cry for Soviet troops across the front. Their sacrifice became part of the mythology of endurance that would later inspire resistance at Stalingrad, Kursk and beyond. The fall of Sevastopol was a defeat, but in Soviet eyes it was also a crucible of experience. From its ruins emerged new strategies, new determination, and new resolve. The city had been lost, but the lessons of its defense would shape future victories. The impact on the Black Sea itself was equally profound. With Sevastopol gone, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet lost its primary base and its greatest fortress. Warships were forced to retreat to ports in the Caucasus, operating under constant Luftwaffe threat and far from their original areas of influence. Supply convoys that once sustained Sevastopol could no longer be attempted, giving the Axis near total control over Crimea's waters. German U-boats and aircraft now prowled freely, turning the Black Sea into a hunting ground where Soviet ships sailed only at great risk. Amphibious operations, once possible, were curtailed, limiting Soviet options for counterattacks in the region. Naval aviation suffered as well, its bases overrun or destroyed in the conquest of Crimea. The fleet, once a symbol of Soviet pride, was reduced to a diminished shadow of itself. For the Soviets, the loss of Sevastopol was not only a strategic setback on land, but also a naval disaster of enduring consequence. The Black Sea no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the Reich. On the Axis side, the conquest of Sevastopol freed resources, but also highlighted the limits of coalition warfare. Romanian divisions had borne heavy losses, their sacrifice essential but costly to national morale. Their role in the siege earned them grudging German respect, but it also strained their ability to sustain operations elsewhere. Italian, Slovak, and other auxiliary forces watched with both awe and apprehension, aware of the price demanded by such triumphs. Sevastopol revealed that even with overwhelming German technology, success required allies willing to bleed beside them. Yet those same allies would later falter at Stalingrad when their battered divisions faced Soviet counteroffensives. The seeds of future disaster were planted even in this moment of triumph. For all the glory claimed in Berlin, the strain was already evident in the Axis coalition. The shadow of Sevastopol stretched far beyond Crimea, shaping the fates of armies across the Eastern Front. The fall of Sevastopol also carried psychological consequences that rippled through both camps. For German soldiers, the victory confirmed their faith in leadership, but it also revealed the staggering price of victory. Many veterans left the Crimea with the grim realization that future battles would demand even greater sacrifices. For Soviet soldiers across the front, the fall was a warning, a reminder that even the strongest fortress could collapse under relentless pressure. Yet rather than break their spirit, it steeled their resolve to fight harder in the battles ahead. In propaganda, Sevastopol was not portrayed as a defeat, but as an epic of endurance against impossible odds. Songs, poems, and stories transformed the city's ruins into a symbol of Soviet courage. For Axis troops, meanwhile, the victory created a dangerous overconfidence, an illusion of invincibility. This illusion would be shattered in the streets of Stalingrad, where confidence met catastrophe. Sevastopol was both triumph and harbinger, a sign of what war on the Eastern Front would demand. In the grand arc of the war, the strategic impact of Sevastopol was undeniable. Its fall freed divisions for Operation Blue, emboldened Hitler's ambitions, and gave the Axis temporary mastery of the Black Sea. Yet it also drained German strength, hardened Soviet resolve, and set the stage for the titanic clash at Stalingrad. The lessons of its defense shaped Soviet doctrine, while the overconfidence of its conquest shaped German miscalculation. The fortress that had once guarded Crimea now lived on as a cautionary tale for both sides. Its ruins testified to the cost of victory, and its memory inspired those who would fight again. Sevastopol's fall was not the end of a story, but a turning point in a larger one. For in the very moment of triumph, the seeds of future defeat were sown. The guns of Sevastopol fell silent, but their echo carried all the way to the Volga, and in that echo, the destiny of the Eastern Front was already being written. The Siege of Sevastopol ended in ruins and silence in July 1942, but its legacy would echo far beyond the shattered city. For the Germans, it stood as one of their greatest operational triumphs, a fortress taken through engineering, persistence, and sheer firepower. For the Soviets, it became a tragedy transfigured into legend, a story of courage immortalized in memory and propaganda. The ruins left behind testified to the ferocity of modern war, where victory was measured not in banners raised, but in the endurance of those who resisted to the end. Survivors carried their scars for life, their stories passed to families who would never forget the suffering. The city itself would not stay silent forever, for in its future reconstruction would mingle with remembrance. Out of its ashes rose not only rebuilt streets, but monuments to those who had fallen. Sevastopol was transformed from fortress into symbol, its story retold as one of unyielding sacrifice, and in that transformation, its true legacy began. In 1945, as the war neared its end, the Soviet Union honored Sevastopol with the title of Hero City. This distinction, one of the highest that could be bestowed, placed the city alongside Leningrad, Stalingrad, and other bastions of Soviet endurance. The title was not merely ceremonial, but an act of canonization, enshrining the defender's sacrifice as part of the state's identity. Monuments rose across the city, carved from granite and bronze, depicting soldiers, sailors, and civilians who had endured the storm. Eternal flames burned beside plaques, listing the fallen, while coastal batteries were preserved as museums of defiance. School children were taught to revere Sevastopol not as a place of defeat, but as a shrine of resilience. Survivors of the siege became living symbols, honored at parades and gatherings where their stories were retold. The title Hero City fused memory with ideology, turning human suffering into national pride. Sevastopol's ruins became not a scar, but a banner carried into the future. In Soviet history, its fall was never an ending, it was a chapter of glory. The physical reconstruction of Sevastopol after the war was itself an act of defiance against the past. Architects and engineers cleared rubble by hand, rebuilding streets that had been cratered and twisted by Dora's shells. New housing rose where entire districts had been erased, designed in the monumental Soviet style of strength and permanence. Hospitals, schools, and theaters were reconstructed, often bearing names that honored the defenders of 1941-42. Naval facilities were restored, the Black Sea Fleet returning to its historic home port, as if reclaiming what had once been lost. Memorials dotted the rebuilt city, ensuring that memory was woven into daily life. Walking through the streets, one could not avoid the presence of the siege, etched into walls, monuments, and even place names. Reconstruction was not just practical, it was symbolic, a statement that destruction would never have the last word. The city lived again, but it lived with ghosts, and in those ghosts the legacy of resistance was preserved. For the German military, Sevastopol remained a benchmark of siege warfare. The operation was studied in detail, its lessons dissected by planners and generals seeking to replicate its methods. Manstein's careful coordination of artillery, air power, and infantry became a model for how to reduce fortresses. The role of superweapons like Dora and the Karl mortars fascinated military engineers, though their cost and complexity limited their future use. Yet the triumph also revealed limitations, for the effort drained divisions that would later be needed at Stalingrad. German veterans of Sevastopol carried their memories to the Volga, only to find that firepower and engineering could not guarantee victory against an enemy that refused to collapse. In later years, historians debated whether the resources poured into Crimea had been worth the price. What was certain was that Sevastopol demonstrated both the heights and the limits of German operational art. It was a victory, but also a lesson in the dangers of triumph bought too dearly. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Sevastopol was woven into the fabric of its wartime mythology. Newspapers, books, and films glorified the city's resistance, emphasizing its endurance rather than its fall. The naval infantry became legends, their black uniforms symbols of unbreakable courage, stories of underground hospitals, starving civilians, and last stands in collapsing bunkers were retold as epics of sacrifice. The image of sailors and soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder with civilians became a defining theme of Soviet memory. Sevastopol was portrayed as a fortress that had fallen, but had never surrendered in spirit. This narrative helped sustain morale during the darkest years of the war, when defeat was common and victory seemed distant. After the war, that mythology became part of the Soviet Union's self-image, a story told to generations as proof of the people's resilience. Sevastopol's legacy was not of defeat, but of immortality. It had become more than a place, it was a symbol. Internationally, the Siege of Sevastopol stood as one of the most extraordinary examples of modern siege warfare. Observers compared it to Verdun, to Leningrad, and to Stalingrad, noting its scale and its human cost. The battle demonstrated the power of industrial warfare, where artillery and air power could reshape landscapes and erase cities. It also revealed the limits of technology, for even the greatest guns could not crush the human will to resist. Military historians traced parallels to sieges across history, from Troy to Masada, recognizing in Sevastopol the timeless themes of endurance and sacrifice. Yet, unlike ancient sieges, this one was fought with weapons that could destroy not just walls, but entire landscapes. Sevastopol became a case study for students of war, its lessons echoing in military academies for decades. Its story belonged not only to the Soviets or the Germans, but to the world. In its ruins lay a warning of what modern war could do. For the people of Sevastopol, legacy was not abstract. It was lived memory. Survivors carried their trauma through the decades, their stories shaping families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. Annual commemorations honored the fallen, with veterans returning to lay flowers at monuments built over their battlefields. Children grew up hearing tales of the siege from parents and grandparents who had endured its horror. The city's identity became inseparable from its history. Every street a reminder, every stone a witness. Even in the late 20th century, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Sevastopol's memory remained a powerful unifying force. To its people, the siege was not simply history, it was part of who they were. The past lived in their daily lives, a shadow but also a source of pride. Sevastopol's scars became its symbols, worn not with shame but with honor. The fortress lived on, not only in monuments, but in hearts. Today, the Siege of Sevastopol endures as one of the most legendary battles of the Second World War. Its story is told not only through books and films, but through the very stones of the city itself. Monuments rise from its hills, museums guard its artifacts, and the harbor still reflects the memory of ships lost in fire. Military historians continue to study its lessons, while families still light candles for ancestors who never returned. The title Hero City remains more than words. It is an identity, a testament carved in granite and memory. Sevastopol's legacy is not one of defeat, but of endurance against overwhelming force. In its ruins was found tragedy, but also inspiration for generations to come. The siege revealed the worst horrors of modern war, but also the highest forms of human courage. Sevastopol fell, but it was never broken. Its legacy lives eternal on the Black Sea.